Hi everyone. Welcome back to Frightening Tales. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe now. Let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Today I told you about my scam that is too interesting for everyone. Let's get started. I scammed department stores and gyms and book chains. You'd be surprised how easy it was to lie and get away. I got my start in my late teens. My mother had a consignment shop/bridal store, which every so often garnered the odd donation of designer clothes. Since this wasn't exactly the kind of place someone came to buy Tommy Hilfiger jeans or a Ralph Lauren sweater, my mother gave me the pick of the donations. Once in a while, I'd find something that fit me, but most of the time, I was hunting for returnables, clothes I could pass off as having been bought somewhere else. In those days, J.C. Penney had the loosest return policy. No receipt? No tags. No problem. They gave the item a once-over and found something comparable in quality to gauge the price. Most stores issued a gift card to a customer without any real evidence of purchase. J.C. Penney always gave cash. This was something I learned from watching my mother, who knew all too well how to root out a good con. Her defining scam was the Christmas special, when, on the day after Christmas, she'd gather up the presents from under the tree and return them to the stores along with the masses, poor mommy forced to return all of her thoughtful gifts. But unlike most of those people, she'd circle back to the stores, once the shift change had taken effect, and repurchase those same presents for vastly reduced prices. Was this out of necessity? Was it out of some need to display her cunning? Looking back, I suspect my mother had become convinced of some higher moral agenda, in which the weak, the middle class, outfox the strong, the rich. All I know is that we always got what we wanted for Christmas. My mom sold the consignment shop when I was in my 20s. By then, I'd decided to become a writer, having fallen in love with The Catcher in the Rye at the age of 17. A college student lacking the funds to feed my literary appetite, and with the habit of underlining passages that eliminated the public library as an option, I stopped returning clothes and started returning books. This was in the mid-1990s, before you had to show ID, sign a slip of paper and answer a battery of questions from the always skeptical supervisor. It was just you, the cashier, and a question of control. You always had to know who was going to be behind that register. That was the golden rule: know your mark. Know whom you could work over and whom you couldn't. This scam demanded a little more effort. It required the pre-con, as I called it, when I scoured my local Salvation Army and Goodwill for 75-cent paperbacks with sharp, clean edges and unblemished pages. I'd buy 15 or 20 at a time and then organize them into semi-thematic groups to sell back to one of the chain bookstores. It was best to keep certain types of books together: self-help with chick lit, biography with history, science fiction with mystery. Trying to return Walter Isaacson's biography of Einstein with, say, a book from the Harry Potter series could elicit enough suspicion to blow the return. Instead, I kept things simple and precise: 3 or 4 books that fit with whatever persona I was trying on that day, and I'd use the store credit to buy the paperbacks I really wanted. I must have pocketed $150 to $200 in books every month for the better part of a year. My biggest single score came when I discovered a dollar store that sold remainders. I bought a hardcover about Richard Nixon with a list price of $35, walked it to the bookstore and left with a gift card for the full amount. Then I went back to the dollar store and bought all 8 remaining copies, returning them sporadically over the next year. I did have 2 basic rules: I only conned corporations, never individuals, and I did not shoplift. Shoplifting wasn't any worse morally, I just thought it was too easy. Instead, I was after a challenge. Sure, it was nice to get a few bucks or a gift card, but the real thrill came from my ability to manipulate, to outwit a large corporation. I wasn't just stealing, I was striking a blow for the common man against big business. It was around this time that I began telling my friends about my exploits. But instead of being disdainful or horrified, I saw a look of amazement and envy in their eyes, and it fed my desire to try new cons. I discovered the McDonald's drive-thru could be exploited if you happened to be out with your hungry 6-year-old nephew sans wallet and sounded particularly desperate. I discovered that if you called the front desk of a certain 5-star hotel and told them that every time you turn on the TV you were assaulted by images of pornography and your wife is pregnant and she doesn't want to see this crap, for Christ's sakes they'll gladly upgrade you to a suite at no extra charge. But what I really learned is that people will believe just about anything you tell them, if you channel the right persona. I discovered just how susceptible people were to the right persona when, for over a year, I attended my local gym in California without becoming a member. I never knew what I was going to say to the worker at the front desk. This is because when you're conning someone, you must always give the illusion that your mind is on something else. Affable indifference works well. For the gym, I used athletic focus. Never once did I approach the front desk walking. I was always running, always in the zone, always pumped. I'd have my earphones in, music blaring, and say that I'd just taken a run around the block, interval training. I'd have my basketball shoes in hand and feign anxiety as I approached. Did the game start already? I'd shake my head impatiently and say that I had to feed the parking meter, briefly criticizing the city's parking regulations, and every time, the worker would sympathize, hand me a towel and tell me to have a good workout. Yes, it was all about persona, and every encounter enabled me to tweak my persona, a regimen of creation and recreation, a perpetual self-sharpening. Hi, I bought this book the other day and I got it home and found that there was writing inside. Of course, beforehand, I'd go hide the remaining copies of said book so the cashier would be forced to give me a store credit. Hi, I bought this shirt the other day and the cashier said that it wouldn't shrink if I washed it, but it shrunk. Hi, you know, I'm not really sure, I'm just making this return for my wife, my mother, my sister, my sick grandmother. Hi, I got this as a graduation gift, a christening gift, a shower gift, a birthday gift. Hi, I forgot my key card upstairs in my room. Is it possible to get another one to get into the fitness center? Hi, no, I'm sorry, but I don't have my receipt. Hi, well, I would like to speak to the manager, please. And each one of these gambits required a follow-up if the situation didn't go as planned. So this is the kind of product you sell in your store? I don't think I want to exchange it because it'll just shrink again. I think it'll probably be better if I just get them a store credit, that way they can pick out what they want. My name? Jack O'Brien. But the room may be under my mother's name. Oh, for some reason she kept her maiden name, I don't know why. Yeah, Berblonsky, that's her. Look, I'm not trying to pull one over on you, said with a laugh to underscore the absurdity of the idea. I would like to just return this item and pick out something else. I work hard for my money, this is ridiculous. Things changed after Minnesota. My wife, Kate, and I were driving back east from California and were on our way to see my friend Lisa in Minneapolis. We rarely saw each other, and I wanted to look nice for the visit. Kate had never met Lisa, so she wanted to look nice, too. We didn't look nice. We didn't smell nice. We needed a shower and, of course, I had a con in mind. In the first hotel, we hit a snag. We asked to see a room and had fully expected the woman at the desk to give us a key, but she didn't. She walked us to the room and stood by as we inspected. Kate looked scared. After making a show of looking around, I asked if breakfast was included. Kate looked at me like I was crazy. It was 1 p.m., and we were due in Minneapolis in 2 hours. Okay, it's perfect, I said. The woman led us to the door, and before we left the room I said, could my wife stay here? She's pregnant, and her feet are killing her. The woman was sympathetic, and as she and I boarded the elevator, I figured Kate would already be in the shower. When we got to the front desk, I said I'd left my wallet in the car. When I came back inside, I said that my wife had it in her purse, upstairs. This all took about 10 minutes, more than enough time for a person to shower, but when I reached the room, I found Kate sitting on the corner of the bed, terrified. "I can't do this," she said. I tried to coax her into the bathroom, but she wouldn't budge. "I just want to go to the car." "Can we go to the car?" An hour later, I talked Kate into giving the scam another try. I told her we'd chosen the wrong hotel. "We need a mom and pop place," I said, "a motel." Eventually, we found a single-story strip of rooms with the office smack in the middle. We pulled the "can we take a look at a room" bit, and the painfully friendly woman, very obviously the proprietor, handed us a key before she displayed her trust by dutifully returning her attention to some paperwork. The room was about 50 yards from the office, but we decided to drive. We parked in front, went inside and began to shower. Somewhere in the middle of lathering and rinsing, the phone began to ring. It rang for an excruciating long period of time, long enough for us to get out of the shower, but neither of us answered it. "Get dressed," I said. When we got outside, the proprietor was already halfway to the room and walking with an intensity that said she knew something was up. Kate walked the key over to her, hoping a polite smile and a little courtesy would halt her. It did not, and Kate got into the car just as the woman inserted the key into the lock and entered the room. I threw the car in reverse, and by the time I'd shifted into drive, the woman was back outside yelling and shaking her fists frantically. As we hit the highway, Kate was screaming, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," her incantation sounding more like a prayer than an alarm. I was compulsively checking my mirrors, convinced that the woman had gotten our plate number. The fallout from Minnesota was not immediate. It took a few weeks for a creeping hesitation to gain hold in my mind and disrupt the years of denial. But I hadn't just scared my wife, I had put us in danger. And I had broken my rule of never targeting individuals. It also began to dawn on me that I'd been targeting individuals all along. Sure, they may have been individuals working for large corporations with deep pockets, but they were also people, real people who trusted me, whose paycheck might have been docked if the registers didn't add up correctly, or if anyone ever caught on. I'd been screwing with these poor people for years, never once considering that my actions could have a direct impact on them. I'm sure I've been responsible for more than one firing or demotion, and that is not something I can make right with some twisty moral rationalizing. Karma is not a principle taught in the Catholic Church. The closest we get to it is the concept of purgatory, that for all the pain we caused on earth, we'll have to spend some time in a waiting room pondering our transgressions before we're called up to heaven. And I believe in this, not with a zealot's humorlessness but with a pragmatic resignation. Somehow, some way, you're gonna pay for what you've done. But the lure of the con is still with me. It's been 4 years since Minnesota, but only days ago, I went to Best Buy to purchase a pair of headphones. The pair I chose were marked $24.99, but when I reached the register, they rang up for $50. I protested, rather mildly, and the cashier told me to bring her the tag. I triumphantly returned a few moments later, and the transaction was completed, the deal was got. But I only partially heard the cashier rue her supervisor's reaction, because my mind was somewhere else. I was thinking about how effortless it would be to set up this con, a simple matter of a few days, long enough for the store to correct the price of the headphones, and for me to lose my receipt. Hi, I was here the other day and Jason Jellick is currently attending culinary school in the Washington, D.C. area. He graduated from Columbia University with an MFA in creative nonfiction. He lives in Maryland with his wife, Kate, and son, Jack. Now I told you a robbery that was done by my great-great-grand cousin. In which how a ragtag gang of retirees pulled off the biggest jewel heist in British history. The police and public gasped at the audacity of the Great Hatton Garden heist of 2015, where millions in cash and jewels were taken from an underground vault in London's Diamond District. Mark Seal investigates the unorthodox daring of the perpetrators and the high-tech investigation that snared them. The plane slowed and leveled out about a mile above ground. Up ahead, the Viennese castle glowed like a fairy tale palace. When the pilot gave the thumbs up, Gerald Blanchard looked down, checked his parachute straps, and jumped into the darkness. He plummeted for a second, then pulled his cord, slowing to a nice descent toward the tiled roof. It was early June 1998, and the evening wind was warm. If it kept cooperating, Blanchard would touch down directly above the room that held the Coeckert diamond pearl. He steered his parachute toward his target. A couple of days earlier, Blanchard had appeared to be just another 20-something on vacation with his wife and her wealthy father. The three of them were taking a 6-month grand European tour: London, Rome, Barcelona, the French Riviera, Vienna. When they stopped at the Schloss Schönbrunn, the Austrian equivalent of Versailles, his father-in-law's VIP status granted them a special preview peek at a highly prized piece from a private collection. And there it was, in a cavernous room, in an alarmed case, behind bulletproof glass, on a weight-sensitive pedestal, a delicate but dazzling 10-pointed star of diamonds fanned around one monstrous pearl. 5 seconds after laying eyes on it, Blanchard knew he would try to take it. The docent began to describe the history of the Coeckert diamond pearl, better known as the Sissi star. It was one of many similar pieces specially crafted for Empress Elizabeth to be worn in her magnificently long and lovely braids. Sissi, as she was affectionately known, was assassinated 100 years ago. Only 2 stars remain, and it has been 75 years since the public had a glimpse of. Blanchard wasn't listening. He was noting the motion sensors in the corner, the type of screws on the case, the large windows nearby. To hear Blanchard tell it, he has a savant-like ability to assess security flaws, like a criminal Rain Man who involuntarily sees risk probabilities at every turn. And the numbers came up good for the star. Blanchard knew he couldn't fence the piece, which he did hear the guide say was worth $2 million. Still, he found the thing mesmerizing and the challenge irresistible. He began to work immediately, videotaping every detail of the star's chamber. He even coyly shot the "No Cameras" sign near the jewel case. He surreptitiously used a key to loosen the screws when the staff moved on to the next room, unlocked the windows, and determined that the motion sensors would allow him to move, albeit very slowly, inside the castle. He stopped at the souvenir shop and bought a replica of the Sissi star to get a feel for its size. He also noted the armed guards stationed at every entrance and patrolling the halls. But the roof was unguarded, and it so happened that one of the skills Blanchard had picked up in his already long criminal career was skydiving. He had also recently befriended a German pilot who was game for a mercenary sortie and would help Blanchard procure a parachute. Just one night after his visit to the star, Blanchard was making his descent to the roof. Aerial approaches are a tricky business, though, and Blanchard almost overshot the castle, slowing himself just enough by skidding along a pitched gable. Sliding down the tiles, arms and legs flailing for a grip, Blanchard managed to save himself from falling 4 stories by grabbing a railing at the roof's edge. For a moment, he lay motionless. Then he took a deep breath, unhooked the chute, retrieved a rope from his pack, wrapped it around a marble column, and lowered himself down the side of the building. Carefully, Blanchard entered through the window he had unlocked the previous day. He knew there was a chance of encountering guards. But the Schloss Schönbrunn was a big place, with more than 1,000 rooms. He liked the odds. If he heard guards, he figured, he would disappear behind the massive curtains. The nearby rooms were silent as Blanchard slowly approached the display and removed the already loosened screws, carefully using a butter knife to hold in place the 2 long rods that would trigger the alarm system. The real trick was ensuring that the spring-loaded mechanism the star was sitting on didn't register that the weight above it had changed. Of course, he had that covered, too. He reached into his pocket and deftly replaced Elizabeth's bejeweled hairpin with the gift store fake. Within minutes, the Sissy star was in Blanchard's pocket and he was rappelling down a back wall to the garden, taking the rope with him as he slipped from the grounds. When the star was dramatically unveiled to the public the next day, Blanchard returned to watch visitors gasp at the sheer beauty of a cheap replica. And when his parachute was later found in a trash bin, no one connected it to the star, because no one yet knew it was missing. It was 2 weeks before anyone realized that the jewelry had disappeared. Later, the Sissy star rode inside the respirator of some scuba gear back to his home base in Canada, where Blanchard would assemble what prosecutors later called, for lack of a better term, the Blanchard Criminal Organization. Drawing on his encyclopedic knowledge of surveillance and electronics, Blanchard became a criminal mastermind. The star was the heist that transformed him from a successful and experienced thief into a criminal virtuoso. Cunning, clever, conniving, and creative, as one prosecutor would call him, Blanchard eluded the police for years. But eventually he made a mistake. And that mistake would take 2 officers from the modest police force of Winnipeg, Canada, on a wild ride of high-tech capers across Africa, Canada, and Europe. Says Mitch McCormick, one of those Winnipeg investigators, "We had never seen anything like it." Blanchard pulled off his first heist when he was a 6-year-old living with his single mother in Winnipeg. The family couldn't afford milk, and one day, after a long stretch of dry cereal, the boy spotted some recently delivered bottles on a neighbor's porch. "I snuck over there between cars like I was on some kind of mission," he says. "And no one saw me take it?" His heart was pounding, and the milk was somehow sweeter than usual. "After that," he says, "I was hooked." Blanchard moved to Nebraska, started going by his middle name, Daniel, and became an accomplished thief. He didn't look the part, slim, short, and bespectacled. He resembled a young Bill Gates, but he certainly played it, getting into enough trouble to land in reform school. "The way I met Daniel was that he stole my classroom VCR," recalls Randy Flanagan, one of Blanchard's teachers. Flanagan thought he might be able to straighten out the soft-spoken and polite kid, so he took Blanchard under his wing in his home mechanics class. "He was a real natural in there," Flanagan says. Blanchard's mother remembers that even as a toddler he could take anything apart. Despite severe dyslexia and a speech impediment, Blanchard was an absolute genius with his hands, the teacher recalls. In Flanagan's class, Blanchard learned construction, woodworking, model building, and automotive mechanics. The two bonded, and Flanagan became a father figure to Blanchard, driving him to and from school and looking out for him. "He could see that I had talent," Blanchard says. "And he wanted me to put it to good use." Flanagan had seen many hopeless kids straighten out. "You never know when something's going to change forever for someone," he says, and he still hoped that would happen to Blanchard. But Daniel was the type of kid who would spend more time trying to cheat on a test than it would have taken to study for it, Flanagan says with a laugh. In fact, by early in his high school years, Blanchard had already abandoned his after-school job stocking groceries to pursue more lucrative opportunities, like fencing tens of thousands of dollars in goods stolen by department store employees he had managed to befriend. "I could just tell who would work with me," he says. "It's a gift, I guess." Blanchard began mastering the workings of myriad mechanical devices and electronics. He became obsessed with cameras and surveillance, documenting targets, his own exploits, and his huge piles of money. Befitting a young tech enthusiast, he emptied an entire Radio Shack one Easter Sunday. At age 16, he bought a house with more than $100,000 in cash. He hired a lawyer to handle the money and sign the deal on his behalf. When he moved in, Blanchard told his mother that the home belonged to a friend. "She looked the other way," Blanchard says. "And I tried to keep it all from her." Around this time, Blanchard was arrested for theft. He did several months behind bars and was released into Flanagan's custody after the older man vouched for him at a hearing. "He was great with our own kids," Flanagan says. "And I still thought he might come around." But Blanchard's burgeoning criminal career was hard to ignore, as he often flaunted his ill-gotten gains. I wasn't surprised when the FBI came knocking one day, Flanagan says. He'd pull out a fistful of hundreds and peel one off to pay for pizza. In April 1993, Blanchard was nabbed by the cops in Council Bluffs, Iowa, for a suspected car arson and brought back to police headquarters. They kept me in the interrogation room past midnight, Blanchard says. And at a certain point, I managed to sneak into the next room and slip through the tiles into the ceiling. Undetected, he heard the cops run down the hall, thinking he'd gone out the fire escape. After waiting a couple of hours, Blanchard lowered himself down into the mostly empty station, stole a police coat, badge, radio, and revolver. After leaving a single bullet on the desk of his interrogator, he took the elevator to the main floor and strolled right past the front desk on his way out of the station. He hitchhiked at dawn back to Omaha on the back of a motorcycle, holding his purloined police cap down in the wind. "Why are you wearing a uniform?" the driver asked. "Costume party," Blanchard said as the sun came up. "Really fun time." The next day, Blanchard was reapprehended by a SWAT team, which had to use flash grenades to extricate him from his mother's attic. But he surprised the cops by escaping yet again, this time from the back of a police cruiser. "They got out of the car and left the keys," Blanchard says. "There was no barrier, so I fiddled with the cuffs until I got my hands in front of me, locked the doors, slipped up front, and put it in gear." The authorities gave chase until Blanchard swerved into a steakhouse parking lot, fled on foot, and was finally recaptured. This time, Blanchard served 4 years and his sentence came with a deportation order attached. In March 1997, he was released to his Canadian homeland and barred from returning to the U.S. for 5 years. After that, Flanagan says, "I heard from Daniel once or twice a year, thanking me for what I had done for him." Blanchard sent pictures of himself vacationing around the world, on exclusive beaches, posing in front of Viennese castles. He said he had his own security business. "I wanted that to be true," Flanagan says. "But I had a hunch he was more likely in the anti-security business." In 2001, Blanchard was driving around Edmonton when he saw a new branch of the Alberta Treasury Bank going up. His internal algorithm calculated low risk, and he began to case the target meticulously. It had been 3 years since the Sassy Star theft, and it was time to try something big and new. As the bank was being built, Blanchard frequently sneaked inside, sometimes at night, sometimes in broad daylight, disguised as a delivery person or construction worker. There's less security before the money shows up, and that allowed Blanchard to plant various surveillance devices in the ATM room. He knew when the cash machines were installed and what kind of locks they had. He ordered the same locks online and reverse engineered them at home. Later he returned to the Alberta Treasury to disassemble, disable, and remount the locks. The take at this bank was a modest 60 grand, but the thrill mattered more than the money anyway. Blanchard's ambition flowered, as did his technique. As Flanagan had observed, Blanchard always wanted to beat the system, and he was getting better at it. Blanchard targeted a half-dozen banks over the next few years. He'd get in through the air conditioning ductwork, at times contorting his body to fit inside really tight spaces. Other times, he would pick the locks. If there were infrared sensors, he'd use IR goggles to see the beams. Or he'd simply fool the sensor by blocking the beam with a lead film bag. He assembled an arsenal of tools, night vision cameras, long-range lenses, high-gain antennas that could pick up the feeds from the audio and video recorders he hid inside a bank, scanners programmed with the encryption keys for police frequencies. He always had a burglary kit on hand containing ropes, uniforms, cameras, and microphones. In the Edmonton branch of the Bank of Nova Scotia, which he hit in 2002, he installed a metal panel near the AC ducts to create a secret crawl space that he could disappear into if surprised by police. Such evasive action was never required, however, in part because Blanchard had also memorized the mechanics of the Moss Hamilton and Lagard locks that many banks used for their ATMs. These are big, complicated contraptions, and when police later interrogated Blanchard, they presented him with a Moss Hamilton lock in dozens of pieces. He stunned them by reassembling it in 40 seconds. Blanchard also learned how to turn himself into someone else. Sometimes it was just a matter of donning a yellow hard hat from Home Depot. But it could also be more involved. Eventually, Blanchard used legitimate baptism and marriage certificates filled out with his assumed names to obtain real driver's licenses. He would even take driving tests, apply for passports, or enroll in college classes under one of his many aliases, James Gemin, Daniel Wall, or Ron Akins. With the help of makeup, glasses, or dyed hair, Blanchard gave James, Daniel, Ron, and the others each a different look. Over the years, Blanchard procured and stockpiled IDs and uniforms from various security companies and even law enforcement agencies. Sometimes, just for fun and to see whether it would work, he pretended to be a reporter so he could hang out with celebrities. He created VIP passes and applied for press cards so he could go to NHL playoff games or take a spin around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway with racing legend Mario Andretti. He met the Prince of Monaco at a yacht race in Monte Carlo and interviewed Christina Aguilera at one of her concerts. That's where, in July 2000, Blanchard met Angela James. She had flowing black hair and claimed to work for Ford Models. They got along right away, and Blanchard was elated when she gave him her number. He sensed that the teenager was down with crime, someone he could count on for help. Blanchard liked having a sidekick. James was a fun, outgoing party animal who had plenty of free time. She eventually began helping Blanchard on bank jobs. They'd tag team on daylight reconnaissance, where her striking looks provided a distraction while Blanchard gathered information. At night, she'd be the lookout. Though they were never involved romantically, James and Blanchard traveled together around the world, stopping in the Caribbean to stash his loot in offshore accounts. They camped out at resorts in Jamaica and the Turks and Caicos Islands, depositing money in $10,000 increments into some of Blanchard's 13 pseudonymously held accounts. The money in the offshore accounts was to pay for his jet-setting lifestyle. The money back in Canada would bankroll his real estate transactions. The funds sitting in Europe were there, well, in case anything happened to him. After midnight on Saturday, May 15, 2004, as the northern prairie winter was finally giving way to spring, Blanchard walked up to the front door of the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce in the Mega Centre, a suburban development in Winnipeg. He quickly jimmied the lock, slipped inside, and locked the door behind him. It was a brand new branch that was set to open for business on Monday, and Blanchard knew that the cash machines had been loaded on Friday. Thorough as ever, Blanchard had spent many previous nights infiltrating the bank to do recon or to tamper with the locks while James acted as lookout, scanning the vicinity with binoculars and providing updates via a scrambled band walkie-talkie. He had put a transmitter behind an electrical outlet, a pinhole video camera in a thermostat, and a cheap baby monitor behind the wall. He had even mounted handles on the drywall panels so he could remove them to enter and exit the ATM room. Blanchard had also taken detailed measurements of the room and set up a dummy version in a friend's nearby machine shop. With practice, he had gotten his ATM cracking routine down to where he needed only 90 seconds after the alarm trip to finish and escape with his score. As Blanchard approached, he saw that the door to the ATM room was unlocked and wide open. Sometimes you get lucky. All he had to do was walk inside. From here he knew the drill by heart. There were 7 machines, each with 4 drawers. He set to work quickly, using just the right technique to spring the machines open without causing any telltale damage. Well rehearsed, Blanchard wheeled out boxes full of cash and several money counters, locked the door behind him, and headed to a van he had parked nearby. 8 minutes after Blanchard broke into the first ATM, the Winnipeg Police Service arrived in response to the alarm. However, The officers found the doors locked and assumed the alarm had been an error. As the police pronounced the bank secure, Blanchard was zipping away with more than $500,000. The following morning was a puzzler for authorities. There were no indications of damage to the door, no fingerprints, and no surveillance recordings. Blanchard had stolen the hard drives that stored footage from the bank's cameras. Moreover, Blanchard's own surveillance equipment was still transmitting from inside the ATM room, so before he skipped town, he could listen in on investigators. He knew their names, he knew their leads. He would call both the bank manager's cell phone and the police, posing as an anonymous informant who had been involved in the heist and was swindled out of his share. It was the contractors, he'd say. Or the Brinks guy. Or the maintenance people. His tips were especially convincing because he had a piece of inside information: one of the bank's ATMs was left untouched. Blanchard had done that on purpose to make it easier to sow confusion. With the cops outmatched and chasing red herrings, the Winnipeg bank job looked like a perfect crime. Then officials got a call from a vigilant employee at a nearby Walmart, which shared a large parking lot with the bank. He had been annoyed at people leaving cars there, so he took it upon himself to scan the lot. On the night of the break-in, he spotted a blue Dodge Caravan next to the bank. Seeing a dolly and other odd equipment inside, he took down the license plate number. Police ran it. The vehicle had been rented from Avis by one Gerald Daniel Blanchard. Blanchard's use of his real name was as careless as the fingerprints police found inside the getaway van recovered by the rental company. Soon the cops were on his tail. Because of the heist's sophistication, the investigation fell to Winnipeg's Major Crimes Unit. But Blanchard, now divorced and living with his girlfriend, Lynette Tien, learned that he had become a suspect, so he stayed out of their sights. 2 years passed, and many of the investigators who had dealt with the initial leads retired or were transferred. The case went cold until early 2006, when Mitch McCormick, a veteran officer in his 50s, started working on major crimes and decided to take a look at the unsolved robbery. Intrigued, he called his longtime colleague Larry Levasseur, a wiretap ace who had just been transferred to the Commercial Crimes Division. One night in early February, McCormick and Levasseur sat down at the King's Head Bar, a favorite local police haunt. Levasseur went through several pints of amber ale, and McCormick had his usual double rye and a Coke tall. McCormick filled him in on the Blanchard leads and gave him the case file to take home. The two were interested, but McCormick's boss was skeptical. Why spend money chasing a criminal who was committing most of his crimes outside their jurisdiction? Eventually, though, the two stubborn cops made such a fuss that the department brass relented. But we got no resources and had to put together a task force out of thin air, McCormick says. It was like the set of Barney Miller. We knew it was bad when we had to buy our own post-its. They quickly started filling up those post-its and arranging them on a corkboard, mapping Blanchard's sprawling network. The case was overwhelming, but they eventually unraveled his tangle of 32 false names. Their preliminary checks also showed that Blanchard was a person of interest in many crimes, including the unsolved theft of the Ceci Star nearly 10 years earlier. They assembled roughly 275 pages of documentation, enough to persuade a judge to let them tap Blanchard's 18 phones. Now they were in business. They were taking a professional flyer on this case. They dubbed their investigation Project Kite. Usually wiretaps are a waiting game. Cops will listen to secretive organized crime syndicates for years, hoping for one little slip. But Blanchard was surprisingly loose-lipped. The second weekend the wires went live, McCormick and Levasseur heard him directing a team of underlings in a product return fraud at a Best Buy. More scams followed. They heard him wheeling and dealing in real estate. They listened in as he planned his next bank job. They learned about a vast network of sophisticated crime. For a smart criminal, McCormick and Levasseur thought, this guy sure did talk a lot. Then, on November 16, 2006, Blanchard got a particularly intriguing call. "Hello, Danny, a man with a thick British accent said. "Are you ready? I have a job for you. How soon can you get to Cairo?" McCormick and Levasseur listened with astonishment as Blanchard immediately set about recruiting his own small team to meet up with another group in Egypt. Blanchard referred to his contact as the boss. He couldn't pronounce his real name and explained to his cohorts that there was money to be made with this guy. James was in. But her parents were in town visiting, and her mother didn't want her to go. James put her mom on the phone so Blanchard could talk the woman into giving her daughter permission to join him in a criminal escapade across the globe. "We're going to make a lot of money," he said. "But don't worry. Everything will be fine." Several of his regular guys couldn't make it, so Blanchard called his neighbor, a Congolese immigrant named Balum Kashongwi. When Blanchard explained the job, Kashongwi volunteered right away. With his team assembled, Blanchard thought, this is going to be easy. What could go wrong? Just a few hours after the boss call, Blanchard, Kashongwi, and James were in the air, en route to Cairo. Blanchard had first met the boss a few months earlier in London at an electronics store. He could tell they were kindred spirits by a glance at the boss' purchases, 8 DVR recorders. Blanchard knew you didn't buy a load like that for anything but surveillance. The two struck up a conversation. Later that day, a car arrived to take Blanchard to a London cafe, where the boss and a dozen Kurdish henchmen, most from northern Iraq, were waiting in the basement, smoking hookahs. The boss filled Blanchard in on his operation, which spanned Europe and the Middle East and included various criminal activities, including counterfeiting and fraud. The latest endeavor was called skimming, gleaning active debit and credit card numbers by patching into the ISDN lines that companies use to process payments. The group manufactured counterfeit cards magnetized and embossed with the stolen numbers and then used them to withdraw the maximum daily limits before the fraud was reported. It was a lucrative venture for the boss network, which funneled a portion of its take to Kurdish separatists in Iraq. Living up to his new nickname, the boss gave Blanchard a trial job, taking 25 cards to Canada to retrieve cash. Blanchard returned to London with $60,000, and the boss was pleased. He found the younger man charming and steady as well. "We have something big coming," he told Blanchard over dinner at a Kurdish restaurant. "I'll keep you posted." With that job now at hand, Blanchard's crew arrived in Egypt and checked into the Cairo Marriott Hotel and Omar Khayyam Casino, settling into a couple of suites with sweeping views of the Nile. The next day, 3 men Blanchard remembered from the London cafe showed up. They brought roughly 1,000 pirated cards, which the group immediately started using in teams of 2. Kashongwi and the Kurds from London blended in easily. Blanchard and James bought burqas in the souk as disguises. The boss directed operations from London. They went from ATM to ATM for 12 hours a day, withdrawing Egyptian pounds and stuffing the bills into backpacks and suitcases. Blanchard and James folded their cash into pouches hidden beneath the burqas. And as usual, Blanchard filmed the entire adventure, the wandering through Cairo's Byzantine streets, the downtime in the city, the money pouring in. Back in their bare-bones Winnipeg office, McCormick and Levasseur were monitoring their targets' email accounts and calls back to Tien, who was managing travel arrangements and other administrative details from Blanchard's condo in Vancouver. The Canadian cops were stunned. They never imagined they'd come across anything this big. They learned about the loot piling up 4 feet high in the suites at the Marriott. And then they learned that everything had gone to hell. In the course of a week, the team collected the equivalent of more than $2 million. But the individual ATM payouts were small, so after a couple of days Blanchard sent Kashongwi south to Nairobi, Kenya, with 50 cards to find more generous machines. Kashongwi had no cell phone, though, and he went suspiciously incommunicado. Soon it became clear that Kashongwi was AWOL. Blanchard wasn't happy. And neither was the boss. Blanchard was in over his head. In his many years of crime, guns had never been involved. The boss, however, seemed inclined to change that. Blanchard promised to track down Kashongwi. Good, the boss said. Otherwise, we'll find him. And he won't be happy when we do. McCormick and Levasseur listened to the calls in and out of Cairo as temperatures rose. They could hear Blanchard calling Tien back in Vancouver, trying desperately to reach Kashongwi. He called Kashongwi's sister in Brussels and his brother in Ottawa. He sounded frantic at times. But Blanchard had no luck. Kashongwi had vanished. Things took another turn for the worse when the boss told Blanchard he couldn't leave Cairo until the missing cards were accounted for. 2 more men arrived to keep an eye on things. The Marriott suites had turned into a hostage scene. But Blanchard's natural charm worked on the boss, too. He took full responsibility, promised to personally pay back Kashongwi's share, and calmly argued that James didn't have anything to do with the double cross. The boss eventually told his men to let James go. Then he agreed to let Blanchard travel to London to smooth things out in person. I'm pretty honest about that kind of thing, Blanchard says. And the boss could see that I was taking responsibility for my guy. The two decided to set aside the Kashongwi problem in the interest of business. The boss men would meet Blanchard back in Canada with a new batch of cards. After all, Blanchard says, why fight when there was more money to be made? On December 3, 2006, Blanchard landed in Vancouver, where he immediately rented a car and drove straight to a branch of the Bank of Nova Scotia, 65 miles east in Chilliwack. He'd started prepping to burglarize the bank before his trip. The Kashongwi fiasco ended up nearly costing Blanchard money, and now he was after a sizable payday. Chilliwack was good for $800,000, he figured, and he would work through the holidays to get it done. McCormick and Levasseur had both been on duty during the holidays before, but never had a case so consumed them. They were spending 18-hour days in their makeshift headquarters or at the King's Head, poring over transcripts and evidence. They got no overtime pay. The strain grew, as did the pressure from higher UPS. Lucky for them, Blanchard's disarray was compounding his mistakes. As soon as he touched down, McCormick and Levasseur picked up Blanchard Live, discussing Cairo, his next bank, and the potential whereabouts of Kashongwi. While Blanchard was en route to Chilliwack, they listened to him and the boss discuss details about the arrival of a team in Montreal the next day. McCormick and Levasseur called officials at the Montreal airport with names and flight information. As the targets strode through the airport, the cops swarmed in. The team was detained, and police seized dozens of blank credit cards, a card writer, and computers overflowing with evidence that filled in the blanks on the Cairo operation. To top it off, the hard drives also contained some of Blanchard's comprehensive amateur crime video of that job. Now the police could not only hear him talking about crimes, they could see him committing them. The boss phoned the very next day, panicked. But the call caught Blanchard at an inopportune moment. I can't talk right now, Blanchard whispered. I'm doing my thing inside the bank right now. It was 12:30 a.m., and Blanchard was crawling through the bank's ductwork. Listen, my guys got arrested in the airport, and I need to find out why, the boss said. Blanchard was making his way painstakingly through the air vents, en route to the ATM room. His earpiece was taped in and the phone was on auto answer, in case he got a call that the police were nearby. What's going on with my guys in Montreal? The boss demanded. They got pulled in. I have no idea, Blanchard said softly. But it's too much of a coincidence that customs knew. The phones must be tapped. The boss pressed on, asking for news about Kashongwi, but Blanchard interrupted. I'm looking down. There's a security guard down there right now, he breathed. He was deep into the building, making it hard to shimmy his way out in case he needed an emergency escape. I have too much invested in this job, he said. I have to go. We need to fix this, Danny, the boss said. As Blanchard whispered back, McCormick and Levasseur were triangulating the call's location. Now they knew Blanchard was targeting Chilliwack's Bank of Nova Scotia. In late January, investigators from Toronto, Edmonton, and Vancouver as well as provincial police and the Mounties had joined McCormick and Levesseur's small operation. Project Kite was ready to be reeled in, McCormick says. At 4 a.m. on January 23, 2007, more than a dozen SWAT team members swarmed Blanchard's Vancouver condo, where they found Blanchard and Tien. Several other search warrants were executed simultaneously across Canada, turning up half a dozen accomplices, including Angela James and Blanchard's cousin Dale Fedoruk. Blanchard was busted. At his various residences and storage facilities, police confiscated 10 pallets of material, 60,000 documents, cash in various currencies, smoke bombs, firearms, and 300 electronic devices, including commercial card printers, card readers, and all manner of surveillance equipment. In his condo, police discovered a hidden room stocked with burglary kits and well-organized, itemized documentation of all Blanchard's fake identities. He was initially charged with 41 crimes, ranging from fraud to possession of instruments for forging credit cards. The boss called Blanchard in jail on the prison phone. "Why you, Danny?" he asked. "Why would little Winnipeg go to all that trouble? You must have upset the establishment. It's like we say in England, you fuck with the Queen, and they fuck with you." As McCormick and Leveseur listened in, Blanchard said it wasn't the establishment, or the Queen. It was these Keystone cops out here in Winnipeg. Blanchard says that he could have escaped from jail again, but there was no point. The police had all the evidence, including 120 video and audio tapes detailing everything. They'd just find him again, and he was tired of running anyhow. Blanchard refused to make statements about any of his associates, but he eventually decided to cooperate with authorities about his own case. "He's a flamboyant guy," McCormick says. "And an extrovert, recording everything. Some part of him just wanted to tell his story. He had another incentive, too, revealing his methods, which would help the banking industry improve its security practices, could earn him a lighter prison sentence." The first day that Leveseur sat down with Blanchard in Vancouver, the investigator felt like he was talking to a wall. But in later interviews, Blanchard became more courteous and helpful. Finally, after some negotiations through his lawyer, Blanchard offered to take them to the Ceci Star. "It's right here in my grandmother's basement in Winnipeg," he said. Blanchard had tried to steer clear of his family since his arrest. He didn't want to embarrass them further. But now he had to call. "I need to come to the house," he said. "And I'm bringing the police." Blanchard, in handcuffs and leg shackles, hugged his grandmother at the door and took McCormick and Leveseur directly into the basement. He disappeared into a crawl space with Leveseur. It was quiet except for the sound of them grappling with the insulation. Eventually, Leveseur removed a square of styrofoam and pulled out the star. They brought it out into the light, where the detectives marveled at the beauty of the piece. They'd never seen anything like it. That kicked off nearly a month of debriefing. The cops had gotten some stuff right, but Blanchard set them straight on the rest. "Never in policing does the bad guy tell you, 'Here's how I did it, down to the last detail,'" McCormick says. And that's what he did. After spending so much time chasing Blanchard and then talking to him, McCormick and Leveseur developed a grudging regard for his abilities. And Blanchard grew to admire their relentless investigation. Like a cornered hacker who trades his black hat for white, Blanchard took on a new challenge, working the system from the inside. He provided such good information that McCormick and Leveseur were able to put together an 8-hour presentation for law enforcement and banking professionals. "When those guys hear what Blanchard told us," McCormick says, "you can hear their assholes pucker shut." Blanchard's full participation came under consideration when he pled guilty to 16 charges on November 7, 2007. He agreed to sell his 4 condos and pay restitution to the Canadian government. and he was willing to take a longer sentence for himself in exchange for leniency toward his co-accused, whom he refused to testify against. None of his partners served jail time. Blanchard also surprised the court by having his lawyer issue an unusual statement, an expression of gratitude for being arrested. "My client wishes to recognize that this huge lie that he had been living could now finally fall apart." It added that Blanchard was looking forward to moving on. He recognizes that the men and women of the Winnipeg Police Service made that all possible. Instead of the maximum of 164 years, Blanchard got 8. And then last summer, after serving less than 2, he was released into carefully guarded probation. He now lives in a Vancouver halfway house, where he is prohibited from going anywhere near certain types of surveillance equipment and talking to any of his former associates. One of the people he can call is Randy Flanagan, his old mentor from high school. "He filled me in about the past 10 years, Flanagan says. "I was surprised, but not that surprised, about what our little former son had been up to." Blanchard told Flanagan he wanted to turn his life around. Working with McCormick and Levasseur had convinced him that he could become a consultant to the banks. "Who knows?" Flanagan says. "Maybe he will get that security business he talked about off the ground after all." The judge had a similar thought during Blanchard's plea hearing. "The banks should hire him and pay him $1 million a year," he said. And right before sentencing, the judge turned directly to Blanchard. "I think that you have a great future ahead of you if you wish to pursue an honest style of life," he said. "Although I'm not prepared to sign a letter of reference." Joshua Behrman wrote about rescuing American hostages from Iran in issue 15.05. The other one I told you all about, a crime story. Inside the Bitcoin bust that took down the web's biggest child abuse site. They thought their payments were untraceable. They couldn't have been more wrong. The untold story of the case that shredded the myth of Bitcoin's anonymity. Early one fall morning in 2017, in a middle-class suburb on the outskirts of Atlanta, Chris Jankowski stood alone inside the doorway of a home he had not been invited to enter. Moments earlier, armed Homeland Security investigations agents in ballistic vests had taken up positions around the tidy two-story brick house, banged on the front door, and when a member of the family living there opened it, swarmed inside. Jankowski, an Internal Revenue Service criminal investigator, followed quietly behind. Now he found himself in the entryway, in the eye of a storm of activity, watching the agents search the premises and seize electronic devices. They separated the family, putting the father, an assistant principal at the local high school and the target of their investigation, in one room, his wife in another, the two kids into a third. An agent switched on a TV and put on Mickey Mouse Clubhouse in an attempt to distract the children from the invasion of their home and the interrogation of their parents. Jankowski had come along on this raid only as an observer, a visitor flown in from Washington, D.C., to watch and advise the local Homeland Security team as it executed its warrant. But it had been Jankowski's investigation that brought the agents here, to this average-looking house with its well-kept yard among all the average-looking houses they could have been searching, anywhere in America. He had led them there based on a strange, nascent form of evidence. Jankowski had followed the links of Bitcoin's blockchain, pulling on that chain until it connected this ordinary home to an extraordinarily cruel place on the internet and then connected that place to hundreds more men around the world. All complicit in the same massive network of unspeakable abuse. All now on Jankowski's long list of targets. Over the previous few years, Jankowski, his partner Tigran Gambaryan, and a small group of investigators at a growing roster of three-letter American agencies had used this newfound technique, tracing a cryptocurrency that once seemed untraceable, to crack one criminal case after another on an unprecedented, epic scale. But those methods had never led them to a case quite like this one, in which the fate of so many people, victims and perpetrators alike, seemed to hang on the findings of this novel form of forensics. That morning's search in the suburb near Atlanta was the first moment when those stakes became real for Jankowski. It was, as he would later put it, a proof of concept. From where Jankowski was positioned at the front of the house, he could hear the Homeland Security agents speaking to the father, who responded in a broken, resigned voice. In another room, he overheard the agents questioning the man's wife. She was answering that, yes, she'd found certain images on her husband's computer, but he'd told her he had downloaded them by accident when he was pirating music. And in the third room he could hear the two grade school-age children, kids about as old as Jankowski's own, watching TV. They asked for a snack, seemingly oblivious to the tragedy unfolding for their family. On a summer's day in London a few months earlier, a UK-born South African tech entrepreneur named Jonathan Levin had walked into the unassuming brick headquarters of the UK's National Crime Agency, Britain's equivalent to the FBI, on the south bank of the Thames. A friendly agent led him to the building's second floor and through the office kitchen, offering him a cup of tea. Levin accepted, as he always did on visits to the NCA, leaving the tea bag in. The two men sat, cups in hand, at the agent's desk in a collection of cubicles. Levin was there on a routine customer visit, to learn how the agent and his colleagues were using the software built by the company he'd co-founded. That company, Chainalysis, was the world's first tech firm to focus solely on a task that a few years earlier might have sounded like an oxymoron: tracing cryptocurrency. The NCA was one of dozens of law enforcement agencies around the world that had learned to use Chainalysis software to turn the digital underworld's preferred means of exchange into its Achilles heel. When Bitcoin first appeared in 2008, one fundamental promise of the cryptocurrency was that it revealed only which coins reside at which Bitcoin addresses: long, unique strings of letters and numbers without any identifying information about those coins' owners. This layer of obfuscation created the impression among many early adherents that Bitcoin might be the fully anonymous internet cash long awaited by libertarian cypherpunks and crypto-anarchists, a new financial netherworld where digital briefcases full of unmarked bills could change hands across the globe in an instant. Jankowski remembers the gravity of the moment hitting him. This was a high school administrator, a husband, and a father of two. Whether he was guilty or innocent, the accusations this team of law enforcement agents were leveling against him, their mere presence in his home, would almost certainly ruin his life. Jankowski thought again of the investigative method that had brought them there, like a digital divining rod, revealing a hidden layer of illicit connections underlying the visible world. He hoped, not for the last time, that it hadn't led him astray. Satoshi Nakamoto, the mysterious inventor of Bitcoin, had gone so far as to write that participants can be anonymous in an early email describing the cryptocurrency. And thousands of users of dark web black markets like Silk Road had embraced Bitcoin as their central payment mechanism. But the counterintuitive truth about Bitcoin, the one upon which Chainalysis had built its business, was this: every Bitcoin payment is captured in its blockchain, a permanent, unchangeable, and entirely public record of every transaction in the Bitcoin network. The blockchain ensures that coins can't be forged or spent more than once. But it does so by making everyone in the Bitcoin economy a witness to every transaction. Every criminal payment is, in some sense, a smoking gun in broad daylight. Within a few years of Bitcoin's arrival, academic security researchers and then companies like Chainalysis began to tear gaping holes in the mask separating Bitcoin users' addresses and their real-world identities. They could follow Bitcoins on the blockchain as they moved from address to address until they reached one that could be tied to a known identity. In some cases, an investigator could learn someone's Bitcoin addresses by transacting with them, the way an undercover narcotics agent might conduct a buy and bust. In other cases, they could trace a target's coins to an account at a cryptocurrency exchange where financial regulations required users to prove their identity. A quick subpoena to the exchange from one of Chainalysis' customers in law enforcement was then enough to strip away any illusion of Bitcoin's anonymity. Chainalysis had combined these techniques for de-anonymizing Bitcoin users with methods that allowed it to cluster addresses, showing that anywhere from dozens to millions of addresses sometimes belonged to a single person or organization. When coins from two or more addresses were spent in a single transaction, for instance, it revealed that whoever created that multi-input transaction must have control of both spender addresses, allowing Chainalysis to lump them into a single identity. In other cases, Chainalysis and its users could follow a peel chain, a process analogous to tracking a single wad of cash as a user repeatedly pulled it out, peeled off a few bills, and put it back in a different pocket. In those peel chains, bitcoins would be moved out of one address as a fraction was paid to a recipient, and then the remainder returned to the spender at a change address. Distinguishing those change addresses could allow an investigator to follow a sum of money as it hopped from one address to the next, charting its path through the noise of Bitcoin's blockchain. Thanks to tricks like these, Bitcoin had turned out to be practically the opposite of untraceable, a kind of honeypot for crypto criminals that had, for years, dutifully and unasably recorded evidence of their dirty deals. By 2017, agencies like the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division, or IRSCI, had traced Bitcoin transactions to carry out one investigative coup after another, very often with the help of Chainalysis. The cases had started small and then gained a furious momentum. Investigators had traced the transactions of two corrupt federal agents to show that, before the 2013 takedown of Silk Road, one had stolen bitcoins from that dark web market and another had sold law enforcement intel to its creator, Ross Ulbricht. Next they tracked down $500 million of bitcoins stolen from the Mt. Gox exchange and showed that the proceeds had been laundered by the Russian administrator of another crypto exchange, BTCE, eventually locating the exchange's servers in New Jersey. And finally, they followed Bitcoin trails to nail down the identity of the founder of Alphabet, a dark web market that had grown to 10 times the size of Silk Road. In fact, even as Levin was sitting in London talking to the NCA agent, a coalition of half a dozen law enforcement agencies was converging in Bangkok to arrest Alphabet's creator. Levin was, as always, on the lookout for Chainalysis' next big investigation. After running through a few open cases with him, the NCA agent mentioned an ominous site on the dark web that had recently come onto the agency's radar. It was called Welcome to Video. He was taken aback by what he saw: an entire network of criminal payments, all intended to be secret, was laid bare before him. The NCA had stumbled across the site in the midst of a horrific case involving an offender named Matthew Falder. An academic based in Manchester, England, Falder would pose as a female artist and solicit nude photos from strangers on the internet, then threaten to share those images with family or friends unless the victims recorded themselves carrying out increasingly demeaning and depraved acts. Ultimately, he'd force his victims to commit self-harm and even sexually abuse others on camera. By the time he was arrested, he had targeted 50 people, at least 3 of whom had attempted suicide. On Falder's computers, the NCA had found he was a registered user of Welcome to Video, a criminal enterprise that, by its sheer scale, put even Falder's atrocities in the shade. This evidentiary lead had then wended its way from the NCA's child exploitation investigations team to the computer crime team, including the cryptocurrency-focused agent at whose desk Levin now sat. Welcome to Video, it seemed, was among the rare sites that sold access to clips of child sexual abuse in exchange for Bitcoin. It was clear at a glance that its library of images and videos was uncommonly large, and it was being accessed and frequently refreshed with brand new material by a sprawling user base around the globe. Sometimes known as child pornography, the class of imagery that was trafficked on Welcome to Video has increasingly come to be called child sexual abuse material by child advocates and law enforcement, so as to strip away any doubt that it involves acts of violence against kids. CSAM, as it is usually abbreviated, had for years represented a massive undercurrent of the dark web, the collection of thousands of websites protected by anonymity software like Tor and I2P. Those anonymity tools, used by millions of people around the world seeking to avoid online surveillance, had also come to serve as the shadow infrastructure for an abhorrent network of abuse, which very often foiled law enforcement's attempts to identify CSAM sites' visitors or administrators. The NCA agent showed Levin a Bitcoin address that the agency had determined was part of Welcome to Video's financial network. Levin suggested they load it in Chainalysis crypto tracing software tool, known as Reactor. He set down his cup of tea, pulled his chair up to the agent's laptop, and began charting out the site's collection of addresses on the Bitcoin blockchain, representing the wallets where Welcome to Video had received payments from thousands of customers. He was taken aback by what he saw. Many of this child abuse site's users and, by all appearances, its administrators had done almost nothing to obscure their cryptocurrency trails. An entire network of criminal payments, all intended to be secret, was laid bare before him. Over the years, Levin had watched as some dark web operators wised up to certain of his firm's crypto tracing tricks. They would push their money through numerous intermediary addresses or mixer services designed to throw off investigators, or use the cryptocurrency Monero, designed to be far harder to track. But looking at the Welcome to Video cluster in the NCA office that day, Levin could immediately see that its users were far more naive. Many had simply purchased bitcoins from cryptocurrency exchanges and then sent them directly from their own wallets into Welcome to Videos. The contents of the website's wallets, in turn, had been liquidated at just a few exchanges, Bithumb and Coinon in South Korea, Huobi in China, where they were converted back into traditional currency. Someone seemed to be continually using large, multi-input transactions to gather up the site's funds and then cash them out. That made it easy work for Reactor to instantly and automatically cluster thousands of addresses, determining that they all belonged to a single service which Levin could now label in the software as Welcome to Video. What's more, Levin could see that the constellation of exchanges surrounding and connected to that cluster likely held the data necessary to identify a broad swath of the site's anonymous users, not simply who was cashing out bitcoins from the site, but who was buying bitcoins to put into it. The blockchain links between Welcome to Video and its customers were some of the most clearly incriminating connections that Levin had ever witnessed. These child sexual abuse consumers seemed to be wholly unprepared for the modern state of financial forensics on the blockchain. By the standards of the cat and mouse game Levin had played for years, Welcome to Video was like a hapless rodent that had never encountered a predator. As he sat in front of the NCA agent's laptop, it dawned on Levin, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that he was living in a golden age of cryptocurrency tracing, that blockchain investigators like those at Chainalysis had gained a significant lead over those they were targeting. We've created something extremely powerful, and we're a step ahead of these types of operators, he remembers thinking. You've got a heinous crime, a terrible thing happening in the world, and in an instant our technology has broken through and revealed in very clear logic who's behind it. Seeing that someone was cashing out the majority of Welcome to Video's revenues through the two exchanges in South Korea, Levin could already guess that the administrator was very likely located there. Many of the site's users seemed to be paying the site directly from the addresses where they'd purchased the coins, on exchanges like Coinbase and Circle, based in the United States. Taking down this global child abuse network might only require getting another law enforcement agency in either the US or Korea involved, one that could demand identifying details from those exchanges. And Levin had just the agency in mind. I have some people who would be interested, he told his NCA host. But first, as he prepared to leave, Levin silently memorized the first 5 characters of the Welcome to Video address the agent had shown him. Chainalysis Reactor software included a feature that could auto-complete Bitcoin addresses based on their first few unique numbers or letters. 5 would be enough, a single short password to unlock the living map of a global criminal conspiracy. It was evening in Thailand when Levin spoke with Chris Jankowski and Tigran Gambaryan. That night in early July 2017, the two IRS criminal investigation special agents were sitting in Bangkok's Suvarnabhumi airport, stewing over the frustration of being sidelined from the biggest dark web market takedown in history. The IRS, by 2017, had come to possess some of the most adept cryptocurrency tracers in the US government. It was Gambaryan, in fact, who had traced the bitcoins of the two corrupt agents in the Silk Road investigations and then cracked the BTCE money laundering case. Working with Levin, Gambarian had even tracked down the Alphabet server, locating it at a data center in Lithuania. Yet when Gambarian and Jankowski had come to Bangkok for the arrest of Alphabet's administrator, the French-Canadian Alexander Cazes, they had been largely excluded from the inner circle of DIA and FBI agents who ran the operation. They hadn't been invited to the scene of Cazes' arrest, or even to the office where other agents and prosecutors watched a video live stream of the takedown. For Gambarian and Jankowski, the story was utterly typical. IRSCI agents did shoe-leather detective work, carried guns, and made arrests, just like their FBI and DIA counterparts. But because of the IRS's dowdy public image, they often found that fellow agents treated them like accountants. "Don't audit me," their peers from other law enforcement branches would joke when they were introduced in meetings. Most IRSCI agents had heard the line enough times that it warranted an instant eye roll. At loose ends in Bangkok, Gambarian and Jankowski spent much of their time idly contemplating what their next case should be, browsing through Chainalysis blockchain tracing software reactor to brainstorm ideas. Dark web markets like Alphabet seemed to have been reduced to a shambles by the Thailand operation, and they'd take months or even years to recover. The agents considered taking on a dark web gambling site. But illegal online casinos hardly seemed worth their attention. On the day of their departure from Thailand, Gambarian and Jankowski arrived at the airport only to find that their flight to DC was badly delayed. Stuck in the terminal with hours to kill, they sat half awake and bored, literally staring at the wall. To pass the hours, Gambarian decided to try calling Chainalysis Levin to discuss next cases. When Levin picked up the phone, he had news to share. He'd been looking into a website that didn't fit among the IRS's usual targets but that he hoped they'd be willing to check out. Welcome to video. Child sexual exploitation cases had traditionally been the focus of the FBI and Homeland Security investigations, certainly not the IRS. In part, that was because child sexual abuse images and videos were most often shared without money changing hands, in what investigators described as a baseball card trading system which put them outside the IRS's domain. Welcome to Video was different. It had a money trail, and it seemed to be a very clear one. Soon after they arrived back in DC, Gambarian and Jankowski enlisted a technical analyst named Aaron Bice from a contract technology firm called Exigent, with whom they'd investigated the crypto exchange BTCE. Together, they charted out Welcome to Video in Reactor and saw what Levin had recognized right away, how glaringly it presented itself as a target. Its entire financial anatomy was laid before them, thousands of clustered Bitcoin addresses, many with barely concealed pay-ins and cash-outs at exchanges they knew they could squeeze for identifying information. It did indeed look, as Levin said, like a slam dunk. In short order, Jankowski brought the case to Zia Faruqi, a federal prosecutor, who was instantly sold on the idea of taking on Welcome to Video and formally opened an investigation. Gambarian, Jankowski, Bice, and Faruqi made an unlikely team to focus on busting a massive child exploitation network. Jankowski was a tall Midwestern agent with a square jaw, like a hybrid of Sam Rockwell and Chris Evans, who wore horn-rimmed glasses when looking at a computer screen. He'd been recruited to the DC computer crimes team from the IRS office in Indiana after proving his mettle in a grab bag of counterterrorism, drug trafficking, government corruption, and tax evasion cases. Bice was an expert in data analysis and was, as Jankowski described his computer skills, part robot. Faruqi was a seasoned assistant U.S. attorney with a long history of national security and money laundering prosecutions. He had an almost manic focus and intensity, spoke in a comically rapid patter, and, it seemed to his colleagues, barely slept. And then there was Gambarian, an agent with buzzed hair and a trim beard who by 2017 had made a name for himself as the IRS's cryptocurrency whisperer and dark web specialist. Faruqi called him Bitcoin Jesus. The team began to realize that, As simple as the slam dunk case had seemed, it was actually overwhelming in its complexity. Yet none of the four had ever worked a child sexual exploitation case. They had no training in handling images and videos of child abuse, whose mere possession, in the hands of normal Americans, represented a felony. They had never even seen these sorts of radioactively disturbing materials, and they had no emotional or psychological preparation for the graphic nature of what they were about to be exposed to. Still, when the two agents showed Faruqi what they saw in the blockchain, the prosecutor was undeterred by their collective inexperience in the realm of child exploitation. As an attorney who focused on money laundering cases, he saw no reason why, with the evidence of criminal payments Jankowski and Gambarian had handed him, they couldn't approach Welcome to Video as, fundamentally, a financial investigation. "We're going to treat this case like we would any other," he said. "We are going to investigate this by following the money." When Jankowski and Gambarian first copied the unwieldy web address, mt3plrdike6gym.onion, into their Tor browsers, they were greeted by a bare-bones site with only the words "Welcome to Video" and a login prompt, a minimalism Jankowski compared to the Google homepage. They each registered a username and password and entered. Past that first greeting page, the site displayed a vast, seemingly endless collection of video titles and thumbnails, arrayed in squares of 4 stills per video, apparently chosen automatically from the file's frames. Those small images were a catalog of horrors, scene after scene of children being sexually abused and raped. The agents had steeled themselves to see these images, but they were still unprepared for the reality. Jankowski remembers the blank shock he felt at the parade of thumbnails alone, the way his brain almost refused to accept what it was seeing. He found that the site had a search page with the misspelled word "search videos" written at the top of it. Below the search field, it listed popular keywords users had entered. The most popular was an abbreviation for 1-year-old. The second most popular was an abbreviation for 2-year-old. Jankowski at first thought he must have misunderstood. He had expected to see recordings of the sexual abuse of young teenagers, or perhaps preteens. But as he scrolled, he found, with mounting revulsion and sadness, that the site was heavily populated with videos of abuse of toddlers and even infants. "This is a thing, really?" "No," Jankowski says, numbly recounting his reactions as he first browsed the site. "Oh, there's this many videos on here? No. This can't be real." The two agents knew that, at some point, they would have to actually watch at least some of the advertised videos. But, mercifully, on their first visits to the site they couldn't access them. To do so, they'd have to pay bitcoins to an address the site provided to each registered user, where they could purchase points that could then be traded for downloads. And since they weren't undercover agents, they didn't have the authorization to buy those points, nor were they particularly eager to. At the bottom of several pages of the site was a copyright date, March 13, 2015. Welcome to Video had already been online for more than 2 years. Even at a glance, it was clear that it had grown into one of the biggest repositories of child sexual abuse videos that law enforcement had ever encountered. You cannot let a child be raped while you go and try to take down a server in South Korea. Simply pulling the site offline couldn't be their first priority. As Jankowski and Gambarian analyzed the site's mechanics, they saw that users could obtain points not just by purchasing them but also by uploading videos. The more those videos were subsequently downloaded by other users, the more points they would earn. "Do not upload adult porn," the upload page instructed, the last 2 words highlighted in red for emphasis. The page also warned that uploaded videos would be checked for uniqueness, only new material would be accepted, a feature that, to the agents, seemed expressly designed to encourage more abuse of children. The element of the site that Gambarian found most unnerving of all, though, was a chat page, where users could post comments and reactions. It was filled with posts in all languages, offering a hint at the international reach of the site's network. Much of the discussion struck Gambarian as chillingly banal, the kind of casual commentary one might find on an ordinary YouTube channel. Gambarian had hunted criminals of all stripes for years now, from small-time fraudsters to corrupt federal law enforcement colleagues to cybercriminal kingpins. He usually felt he could fundamentally understand his targets. Sometimes, he'd even felt sympathy for them. "I've known drug dealers who are probably better human beings than some white-collar tax evaders," he mused. "I could relate to some of these criminals. Their motivation is just greed." But now he'd entered a world where people were committing atrocities that he didn't understand, driven by motivations that were entirely inaccessible to him. After a childhood in war-torn Armenia and post-Soviet Russia and a career delving into the criminal underworld, he considered himself to be familiar with the worst that people were capable of. Now he felt he had been naive. His first look at Welcome to Video exposed and destroyed a hidden remnant of his idealism about humanity. "It killed a little bit of me," Gambarian says. As soon as they had seen firsthand what Welcome to Video truly represented, Gambarian and Jankowski understood that the case warranted an urgency that went beyond that of even a normal dark web investigation. Every day the site spent online, it enabled more child abuse. Gambarian and Jankowski knew their best lead still lay in the blockchain. Crucially, the site didn't seem to have any mechanism for its customers to pull money out of their accounts. There was only an address to which they could pay for credits on the site. There didn't even seem to be a moderator to ask for a refund. That meant that all the money they could see flowing out of the site, more than $300,000 worth of bitcoins at the time of the transactions, would almost certainly belong to the site's administrators. Gambarian began reaching out to his contacts in the Bitcoin community, looking for staff at exchanges who might know executives at the two Korean exchanges, Bedtime and Coinon, into which most of Welcome to Video's money had been cashed out, as well as one U.S. exchange that had received a small fraction of the funds. He found that the mere mention of child exploitation seemed to evaporate the cryptocurrency industry's usual resistance to government intervention. "As libertarian as you want to be," Gambarian says, "this is where everybody kind of drew the line." Even before he sent a formal legal request or subpoena, staff at all three exchanges were ready to help. They promised to get him account details for the addresses he had pulled from Reactor as soon as they could. Gambarian couldn't help it. Sitting in front of his computer screen in his DC cubicle, staring at the flaw he'd discovered, the agent started to laugh. In the meantime, Gambarian continued to investigate the Welcome to Video site itself. After registering an account on the site, he thought to try a certain basic check of its security. A long shot, he figured, but it wouldn't cost anything. He right-clicked on the page and chose View Page Source from the resulting menu. This would give him a look at the site's raw HTML before it was rendered by the Tor browser into a graphical web page. Looking at a massive block of code, anyway, certainly beat staring at an infinite scroll of abject human depravity. He spotted what he was looking for almost instantly: an IP address. In fact, to Gambarian's surprise, every thumbnail image on the site seemed to display, within the site's HTML, the IP address of the server where it was physically hosted: 121.185.153.64. He copied those 11 digits into his computer's command line and ran a basic trace route function, following its path across the internet back to the location of that server. Incredibly, the results showed that this computer wasn't obscured by Tor's anonymizing network at all. Gambarian was looking at the actual, unprotected address of a Welcome to Video server. Confirming Levin's initial hunch, the site was hosted on a residential connection of an internet service provider in South Korea, outside of Seoul. Welcome to Video's administrator seemed to have made a rookie mistake. The site itself was hosted on Tor, but the thumbnail images it assembled on its homepage appeared to be pulled from the same computer without routing the connection through Tor, perhaps in a misguided attempt to make the page load faster. Gambarian couldn't help it, sitting in front of his computer screen in his DC cubicle, staring at the revealed location of a website administrator whose arrest he could feel drawing closer. The agent started to laugh. Jankowski was at a firing range in Maryland, waiting his turn in a marksmanship exercise, when he got an email from the American cryptocurrency exchange his team had subpoenaed. It contained identifying information on the suspected Welcome to Video administrator who had cashed out the site's earnings there. The email's attachments showed a middle-aged Korean man with an address outside of Seoul exactly corroborating the IP address Gambarian had found. The documents even included a photo of the man holding up his ID, apparently to prove his identity to the American exchange. For a moment, Jankowski felt as though he were looking at Welcome to Video's administrator face to face. But he remembers thinking that something was off. The man in the picture had noticeably dirty hands, with soil under his fingernails. He looked more like a farm worker than the hands-on keyboard type he'd expected to be running a site on the dark web. Over the next days, as the other exchanges fulfilled their subpoenas, the answer began to come into focus. One Korean exchange and then the other sent Gambarian documents on the men who controlled Welcome to Video's cash-out addresses. They named not just that one middle-aged man but also a much younger male, 21 years old, named Sun Jong-woo. The two men listed the same address and shared the same family name. Were they father and son? The agents believed they were closing in on the site's administrators. But they had come to understand that merely taking down the site or arresting its admins would hardly serve the interests of justice. The constellation of Bitcoin addresses that Welcome to Video had generated on the blockchain laid out a vast, bustling nexus of both consumers and far more importantly producers of child sexual abuse materials. By this point, Faruqi had brought on a team of other prosecutors to help, including Lindsay Suttonberg, an assistant U.S. attorney with expertise in child exploitation cases. She pointed out that even taking the site offline shouldn't necessarily be their first priority. You cannot let a child be raped while you go and try to take down a server in South Korea, as Faruqi summed up her argument. The team began to realize that, as simple as the slam dunk case had seemed at first, after the easy identification of the site's admins, it was actually overwhelming in its complexity. They would need to follow the money not to just one or two web administrators in Korea, but also from that central point to hundreds of potential suspects, both active abusers and their complicit audience of enablers around the entire globe. Gambarian's right-click discovery of the site's IP address and the quick cooperation from crypto exchanges had been lucky breaks. The real work still lay ahead. Just 2 weeks after Levin passed along his tip, the team of IRSCI agents and prosecutors knew almost exactly where Welcome to Video was hosted. But they also knew they'd need help to go further. They had neither connections to the Korean National Police Agency, which had a reputation for formality and impenetrable bureaucracy, nor the resources to arrest what could be hundreds of the site's users, an operation that would require far more personnel than the IRS could muster. Faruqi suggested they bring Homeland Security investigations in on the case, partnering with a certain field office across the country, in Colorado Springs. He'd chosen that agency and its far-flung outpost because of a specific agent there whom he'd worked with in the past, an investigator named Thomas Tamsi. Faruqi and Tamsi had together unraveled a North Korean arms trading operation a year earlier, one that had sought to smuggle weapon components through South Korea and China. In the course of that investigation, they'd flown to Seoul to meet with the Korean National Police, where, after some introductions by an Shi liaison there, they spent an evening with Korean officers drinking and singing karaoke. Others on the team couldn't stand to hear Suttonberg describe the videos. They would ask me to stop talking, to put it in writing, she remembers, and then they'd tell me that was even worse. At a particularly memorable point in the night, the Korean agents had been ribbing the US team for their alleged hot dog and hamburger diets. One agent mentioned sunakji, a kind of small octopus that some Koreans eat not merely raw but alive and writhing. Tamsi had gamely responded that he'd try it. A few minutes later, a couple of the Korean agents had brought to the table a fist-sized, living octopus wrapped around a chopstick. Tamsi put the entire squirming cephalopod in his mouth, chewed, and swallowed, even as its tentacles wriggled between his lips and black ink dripped from his face onto the table. It was absolutely horrible, Tamsi says. The Koreans found this hilarious. Tamsi gained near legendary status within certain circles of the Korean National Police, where he was thereafter referred to as Octopus Guy. Like most of their group, Tamsi had no experience in child exploitation cases. He had never even worked on a cryptocurrency investigation. But Faruqi insisted that to make inroads in Korea, they needed Octopus Guy. Not long afterward, Tamsi and a fellow Shi agent authorized for undercover operations flew to Washington, D.C. They rented a conference room in a hotel, and as Jang Choski watched, the undercover agent logged on to Welcome to Video, paid a sum of bitcoins, and began downloading gigabytes of videos. The strange choice of location, a hotel rather than a government office, was designed to better mask the agent's identity, in case Welcome to Video could somehow track its users despite Tor's protection, and also so that, when it came time to prosecute, the DC Attorney's Office would be given jurisdiction. The Shi agent did, at least, use a Wi-Fi hotspot for his downloading, to avoid siphoning the web's most toxic content over the hotel's network. As soon as the undercover agent's work was complete, they shared the files with Jang Choski, who, along with Lindsay Suttonberg, would spend the following weeks watching the videos, cataloging any clues they could find to the identities of the people involved, while also saturating their minds with enough images of child abuse to fill anyone's nightmares for the rest of their lives. Suttonberg's years as a child exploitation prosecutor had left her somewhat desensitized. She would find that other attorneys on the team couldn't stand to even hear her describe the contents of the videos, much less watch them. They would ask me to stop talking, to put it in writing, she remembers, and then they'd tell me that was even worse. Jang Choski, as lead agent on the case, was tasked with putting together an affidavit that would be used in whatever charging document they might eventually bring to court. That meant watching dozens of videos, looking for ones that would represent the most egregious material on the site, and then writing technical descriptions of them for a jury or judge. He compares the experience to a scene from A Clockwork Orange, an unending montage from which he constantly wanted to avert his gaze but was required not to. He says watching those videos altered him, though in ways he could only describe in the abstract ways even he's not sure he fully understands. There's no going back, Jang Choski says, vaguely. Once you know what you know, you can't unknow it. And everything that you see in the future comes in through that prism of what you now know. In the first weeks of fall 2017, the team investigating the Welcome to Video network began the painstaking process of tracing every possible user of the site on the blockchain and sending out hundreds of legal requests to exchanges around the world. To help analyze every tendril of Welcome to Video's cluster of Bitcoin addresses in Reactor, they brought on a Chainalysis staffer named Aaron Akbayakian, an Armenian-American former police officer from Fresno whom Gambarian knew from childhood and had recommended to Levin. Akbayakian's job was to perform what he called a cluster audit, squeezing every possible investigative clue out of the site's cryptocurrency trails. That meant manually tracing payments back from one prior address to another, until he found the exchange where a Welcome to Video customer had bought their bitcoins and the identifying information that the exchange likely possessed. Plenty of Welcome to Video's users had made his job easy. It was a beautiful clustering in Reactor, Akbayakian says. It was just so clear. In some cases, he would trace back chains of payments through several hops before the money arrived at an exchange. But for hundreds of users, he says, he could see wallet addresses receive money from exchanges and then put the funds directly into Welcome to Video's cluster, transactions that had created, as Akbayakian put it, leads as clean as you could want. As responses from exchanges with those users' identity information began to pour in, the team started the process of assembling more complete profiles of their targets. They began to collect the names, faces, and photos of hundreds of men. They were almost all men from all walks of life, everywhere in the world. Their descriptions crossed boundaries of race, age, class, and nationality. All these individuals seemed to have in common was their gender and their financial connection to a worldwide, hidden haven of child abuse. By this time, the team felt they'd pinned down the site's Korean administrator with confidence. They'd gotten a search warrant for Sun Jong-woo's Gmail accounts and many of his exchange records, and they could see that he alone seemed to be receiving the cashed-out proceeds from the site, not his father, who increasingly seemed to the investigators like an unwitting participant, a man whose son had hijacked his identity to create cryptocurrency accounts. In Sun Jong-woo's emails, they found photos of the younger man for the first time, selfies he'd taken to show friends where he'd chipped a tooth in a car accident, for instance. He was a thin, unremarkable-looking young Korean man with wide-set eyes and a Beatles-esque mop top of black hair. For several reasons, we've chosen not to identify the defendants in the Welcome to Video case by name, with the exception of the site's administrator. In some instances, at the time of this writing, a defendant's case had not been fully adjudicated. In other cases, we left out names at the request of prosecutors, to avoid providing information that might inadvertently identify victims. We applied the same standard to the rest, to avoid singling out some offenders while others went unnamed. But as their portrait of this administrator took shape, so too did the profiles of the hundreds of other men who had used the site. A few immediately stuck out to the investigative team. One suspect, to the dismay of Thomas Tamsey and his Homeland Security colleagues, was an NSA agent in Texas. Another, they saw with a different sort of dread, was the assistant principal of a high school in Georgia. The school administrator had posted videos of himself on social media singing duets, karaoke style, with teenage girls from his school. The videos might otherwise have been seen as innocent. But given what they knew about the man's Bitcoin payments, agents who had more experience with child exploitation warned Jankowski that they might reflect a form of grooming. These were men in privileged positions of power, with potential access to victims. The investigators could immediately see that, as they suspected, they would need to arrest some of Welcome to Video's users as quickly as possible, even before they could arrange the takedown of the site. Child exploitation experts had cautioned them that some offenders had systems in place to warn others if law enforcement had arrested or compromised them, code words or dead man switches that sent out alerts if they were absent from their computer for a certain period of time. Still, the Welcome to Video investigation team felt they had little choice but to move quickly and take that risk. Another suspect, around the same time, came onto their radar for a different reason. He lived in Washington, D.C. The man's home, in fact, was just down the street from the U.S. Attorney's office, near the Capitol's Gallery Place neighborhood. He happened to live in the very same apartment building that one of the prosecutors had only recently moved out of. That location, they realized, might be useful to them. Jankowski and Gambarian could easily search the man's home and his computers as a test case. If that proved the man was a Welcome to Video customer, they would be able to charge the entire case in DC's judicial district, overcoming a key legal hurdle. As they dug deeper, though, they found that the man was a former congressional staffer and held a high-level job at a prestigious environmental organization. Would arresting or searching the home of a target with that sort of profile cause him to make a public outcry, sinking their case? Just as they trained their sights on this suspect in their midst, however, they found that he had gone strangely quiet on social media. Someone on the team had the idea to pull his travel records. They found that he had flown to the Philippines and was about to fly back to DC via Detroit. There were suitcases still not fully unpacked from the trip. The man had ordered a pizza the night before, and part of it remained uneaten on the table. This discovery led the agents and prosecutors to two thoughts. First, the Philippines was a notorious destination for sex tourism, often of the kind that preyed on children. The SHE office in Manila constantly had its hands full with child exploitation cases. Second, when the man flew back to the U.S., Customs and Border Protection could legally detain him and demand access to his devices to search for evidence, a bizarre and controversial carve-out in Americans' constitutional protections that, in this case, might come in handy. Would their DC-based suspects sound the alarm and tear the lid off their investigation, just as it was getting started? Yes, This all had the potential to blow up our case, Jankowski says. But we had to act. In late October, Customs and Border Protection at the Detroit Metropolitan Airport stopped a man disembarking from a plane from the Philippines on his way back to Washington, D.C., asking him to step aside and taking him into a secondary screening room. Despite his vehement protests, the border agents insisted on taking his computer and phone before allowing him to leave. A few days later, on October 25, the prosecutor who had lived in the same D.C. apartment block as the suspect saw an email from her old building's management. She'd remained on the distribution list despite having moved out. The email noted that the parking garage ramp in an alley at the back of the tower would be closed that morning. An unnamed resident, it explained, had landed there after jumping to their death from the balcony of their apartment. The prosecutor put two and two together. The jumper was their welcome to video test case. Jankowski and Gambarian immediately drove to the apartment tower and confirmed with management, the very first target of their investigation had just killed himself. Later that day the two IRSCI agents returned to the scene of the man's death with a search warrant. They rode the elevator up to the 11th floor with the building's manager, who was deeply puzzled as to why the IRS was involved, but wordlessly unlocked the door for them. Inside they found an upscale, moderately messy apartment with high ceilings. There were suitcases still not fully unpacked from a trip. The man had ordered a pizza the night before, and part of it remained uneaten on the table. Jankowski remembers feeling the somber stillness of the man's empty home as he imagined the desperate choice he had faced the night before. Looking down 11 floors from the balcony, the agent could see the spot in the alleyway below where the pavement had recently been hosed off. DC's Metropolitan Police offered to show the agents a security cam video of the man falling to his death. They politely declined. The Customs and Border Protection Office in Detroit, meanwhile, confirmed that they had searched the computer seized from the man at the airport. Some of its storage was encrypted, but other parts were not, and found child exploitation videos, along with surreptitiously recorded videos of adult sex. Their decision to target the man had served its purpose. Their test case had come back positive. The prosecutors in D.C. paused their work briefly to meet and acknowledge the surreal shock of the man's death. Their investigation of a site hosted halfway around the world had already led someone to kill themselves, just blocks away. It was just a reminder of how serious what we were investigating was, Faruqi says. Still, the group agreed, they couldn't let the suicide distract them from their work. We've got to focus on the victims here, Faruqi remembers them telling each other. That provides clarity. Jankowski says he would have much preferred that the man be arrested and charged. But he had, by this point, been forced to watch hour after hour of child sexual abuse videos. He had put aside his emotions early on in the case, and he had few sympathies to spare for an apparent customer of those materials. If he felt anything, he admits, it was relief, given the time that the suicide had saved him. They still had hundreds more welcome to video customers to pursue. Next on their list was the high school assistant principal. Just days later, Jankowski flew down to Georgia and joined a tactical team of SHE agents as they carried out their search. For the first time, he came face to face with an alleged welcome to video client in his own home. In spite of his stoicism, this second test case affected Jankowski more than the DC target had. The tidy, well-kept brick two-story house. The parents questioned in separate rooms. The kids the same age as Jankowski's own, watching Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. As he stood in the entryway of that house outside of Atlanta, the full toll of the investigation hit him, the fact that every name on their list was a person with human connections and, in many cases, a family. That even accusing suspects of such an unforgivable crime had an irreversible impact on their lives, that it was a scarlet letter for someone that just cannot be undone, as he put it. Jankowski and the SHE agents stayed at the home long enough to search it, to question the man, and to seize his devices for analysis. In addition to the evidence of the man's payments for material on Welcome to Video, Faruqi says that the man also admitted to inappropriately touching students at his school. The man would later be charged with sexual assault of minors, though he would plead not guilty. For Jankowski, at least, any last doubts he had felt after his first confrontation with a suspect based on cryptocurrency tracing alone were dispelled in a matter of hours. At the end of the day, I felt more confident, he says. We were correct. The blockchain had not lied. The team was steadily working their way through their short list of high-priority welcome to video targets and test cases. But in December 2017, they came upon a different sort of lead, one that would scramble their priorities yet again. As they followed welcome to video's financial trails, investigators had been careful to record the full contents of the site's chat page, where users were still posting a steady stream of comments against a backdrop of spam and trolling typical of any anonymous web forum. The site seemed to be entirely unmoderated. There was not so much as an admin email or help contact visible anywhere. But Jankowski began to notice repeated messages from one account that seemed to offer the closest thing the site had to that missing help desk contact. Contact the admins. The messages read, if you want assistance in fixing error. It included an address on Torbox, a privacy-focused Tor-based email service. Was this an actual moderator on the site? Or even the administrator himself, the owner of the site, who they now believed to be Sun Jong-woo? As Jankowski tried to decipher who was behind those messages, he checked the username before the @ in the Torbox address, a unique-looking string of 6 characters, to see if it matched a user on Welcome to Video. Sure enough, he found that someone with that same handle had uploaded more than 100 videos. On the wall, Jankowski noticed a poster he'd seen in the videos. He momentarily felt as though he'd fallen through his own computer screen into the set of a horror film. Exigence Aaron Bice had the idea to run this Torbox email address against a database seized from BTCE during IRSCI's probe of the crypto exchange, to search for clues in its treasure trove of criminal underworld user data. Bice found a match. One account on BTCE had been registered with an email address that included that same unique string of 6 characters. It wasn't the Torbox email address, but one from a different privacy-focused email service called Segaint. Jankowski knew that Torbox and Segaint, both dark web services themselves, wouldn't respond to legal requests for their users' information. But the BTCE data included IP addresses for 10 past logins on the exchange by the same user. In 9 out of 10, the IP address was obscured with a VPN or Tor. But in one single visit to BTCE, the user had slipped up. They had left their actual home IP address exposed. That opened the whole door, says Jankowski. A trace route showed that the IP address led to a residential internet connection not in Korea this time, but in Texas. Was there a second Welcome to Video admin, this one based in the US? Jankowski and Bice continued pulling the thread with increasing urgency, subpoenaing the user's account information from their internet service provider. It was a Friday morning in early December, and Jankowski was drinking coffee at his desk in the IRSCI office when he got back the results of that subpoena. He opened the email to find a name and a home address. The man was an American in his 30s who lived in a town outside of San Antonio, an unlikely collaborator for a 21-year-old Korean managing a child exploitation site from 15 time zones away. But the man's employment, when Jankowski looked it up, was even more jarring. He was another Department of Homeland Security staffer, this time a Border Patrol agent. Jankowski quickly began to assemble public information about the agent from his social media accounts. He first found a Facebook page for the man's wife, and later an account for the man himself, with his name written backwards to obscure it. Bice dug up his Amazon page, too, where he seemed to have left reviews on hundreds of products and put others on a wish list, including external storage devices that could hold terabytes of videos, hidden cameras, and other cameras designed to be snaked through small spaces, like holes drilled in a wall. Finally, with a creeping sense of dread, Jankowski saw that the Border Patrol agent's wife had a young daughter and that he had created a crowdfunding page on GoFundMe to raise money to legally adopt the girl as his stepdaughter. Fuck, Jankowski thought to himself. Did he upload videos of the daughter? Jankowski looked back at Welcome to Video and saw that some of the thumbnails of the videos uploaded by the person with this username showed the sexual assault of a young girl about the daughter's age. He realized he now had a duty to separate this Border Patrol agent from his victim as swiftly as possible. For the next 10 days, Jankowski barely left his desk. He'd drive home, eat dinner quickly with his family in their small Arlington, Virginia, townhouse, then drive back to the office to work late, often calling Bice and Faruqi well into the night. "You are rarely in a situation where your time is zero-sum," Faruqi says. "Every moment we were not working on that case, a little girl could be getting raped." Jankowski asked their undercover she agent to download the videos that had been uploaded by the Texas agent, and he began the grueling process of watching them one by one. A few videos in, he spotted something that jolted the pattern-matching subroutines of his brain. At one point in the recording, the girl in the video had a red flannel shirt tied around her waist. He looked back at a photo of the girl posted to the GoFundMe page and saw it. She was wearing the same red flannel. Was this Border Patrol agent an admin on Welcome to Video? A moderator? It hardly mattered. Jankowski now believed he had found the identity of an active child rapist who lived with his victim and had been recording and sharing his crimes with thousands of other users. The Texas man had earned a place at the very top of their target list. 2 weeks before Christmas, on the 10th day after he'd identified the Border Patrol agent, Jankowski flew to southern Texas, along with She's Thomas Tamsey and his team's child exploitation-focused prosecutor, Lindsay Suttonberg. On a cool, dry evening about 100 miles from the Mexican border, Tamsey and a group of Texas State Police officers tailed their target as he drove home from work and pulled him over. Together with a group of FBI agents, they took the man to a nearby hotel for questioning. The team's initial list of high-priority suspects was finally checked off. They could move on to their primary target, Sun Jong-woo. Meanwhile, Jankowski and a group of local Homeland Security investigators entered the man's house and began to search for evidence. The two-story home was run down and messy, Jankowski remembers, with the exception of the man's well-organized home office on the second floor, where they found his computer. Down the hall from that office he came to the girl's bedroom and immediately recognized it as the scene where the videos uploaded by the man had been filmed. On the wall he noticed a poster he'd seen in the recordings and momentarily felt as though he'd fallen through the screen of his own computer into the set of a horror film. The IRS agent and prosecutor had brought with them an FBI interviewer with child exploitation experience, who separated the girl from the agents searching her home and took her to a safer location. The girl eventually detailed to the interviewer the abuse she'd endured. Shortly after the search of the Border Patrol agent's home, Jankowski arrived at the hotel room where other agents were questioning their suspect. He saw, for the first time, the target of his last week-and-a-half's obsession. The man was tall and burly, still in his uniform, with thinning hair. He initially refused to talk about any physical abuse he might have committed, Jankowski says, but he eventually confessed to possessing, sharing, and finally making child sexual abuse videos. Jankowski was struck by the dispassionate, almost clinical way the man described his actions. He gave his interrogators the password to his home computer, and an agent still at the house began pulling evidence from the machine and sending it to Jankowski. It included detailed spreadsheets of every child sexual exploitation video the man had both amassed on his hard drives and, by all appearances, filmed in his own home. Another spreadsheet from the man's computer contained a long list of other Welcome to Video users' login credentials. Under questioning, the man explained his scheme. He would pose as an administrator in messages he posted to the site's chat page, then ask users who took the bait to send him their usernames and passwords, which he'd use to log into their accounts and access their videos. The Border Patrol agent had never been a Welcome to Video administrator or moderator at all, only a particularly devious visitor to the site, willing to scam his fellow users to support his own appetites. After an intense 10 days, they'd identified and arrested another alleged child abuser, even rescued his victim. But as he flew back to DC, Jankowski knew that Welcome to Video's vastly larger network of abuse remained very much intact. And until they took the site itself down, it would continue to serve its videos, including the very ones the Border Patrol agent had uploaded from his Texas home office to an anonymous throng of consumers just like him. In early January of 2018, the DC investigators got word from Thomas Tamsey that he and the team had arrested the other federal law enforcement customer of Welcome to Video, the she agent who'd shown up early in their blockchain tracing and subpoenas. Though seemingly unconnected to the Border Patrol agent case, this second agent had been based in Texas, too, less than an hour away from the home of the man they had just raided. Aside from that grim coincidence, the news of the she agent's arrest also meant that the DC team's initial list of high-priority suspects was finally checked off. They could move on to their primary target, Sun Jong-woo, and the Welcome to Video server under his control. By February, that Korea-focused operation was coming together. Before the Texas arrests, Jankowski, Gambaryan, Farooqi, and Tamsey had flown to Seoul to meet the Korean National Police Agency. At a dinner set up by the local she attaché, the director of the KNPA himself told Tamsey, whose octopus-eating reputation preceded him, that the Americans would have the help of his best team. Soon they had Sun Jong-woo under constant surveillance as he came and went from his home, an apartment 2.5 hours south of Seoul in the province of South Chungcheong. Now, in the depths of winter on the Korean peninsula, just a week after Korea had hosted the Olympics in Pyeongchang, the American agents arrived in Seoul again. Gambaryan had to stay behind for a badly timed conference where the agency's director had volunteered him to speak. But Jankowski and Farooqi brought with them Aaron Bice and Yali Lee, a Korean-American computer crime prosecutor on their team. By this point, too, a growing international force had assembled around the case. The UK's National Crime Agency, which had launched its own investigation into Welcome to Video just after Levin's London visit, sent 2 agents to Seoul, and the German Federal Police also joined the coalition. It turned out the Germans had been pursuing the site's administrators independently, even before they'd learned about the IRS's investigation, but they'd never been able to secure the cooperation of the Korean National Police. At one point Farooqi remembers a German official asking him, as they stood in the cold outside the Seoul hotel where they were staying, how the Americans had gotten the Koreans on board so quickly. "Oh, octopus guy," Farooqi had explained. "You don't have octopus guy. We have octopus guy." For their first days in Seoul, the takedown team met repeatedly in the Korean National Police offices to talk through their plans. Their tracing of the IP address, based on Gambaryan's fortuitous right-click, seemed to show that the site's server was located, bizarrely, not in any web hosting firm's data center but in Sun Jong-woo's own apartment, the evidentiary hub of a massive child sexual abuse video network, sitting right in his home. That made things simple. They would arrest him, tear his site offline, and use that evidence to convict him. The team made a plan to grab him in his apartment early on a Monday morning. Then, on the Friday before, Jankowski got a cold. He spent much of the weekend with prosecutor Yali Lee, dazedly wandering between markets and stores in Seoul trying to pronounce gasubji, the Korean word for humidifier. On Sunday evening, he took a dose of what he hoped was a Korean equivalent of NyQuil. He couldn't read the label with the intention of getting some sleep and recovering in time to be at full strength for the arrest. That's when the KNPA alerted the team that the plan had changed. Sun had unexpectedly driven into Seoul for the weekend. Now the team following his whereabouts believed he had begun a late-night drive back to his home south of the city. If the police could drive down to Sun's home that night and stake it out, perhaps they could be there when he returned, ready to arrest him at his door. That way he couldn't destroy evidence or another looming concern after the death of their Washington, D.C. target commit suicide. "We had to scramble," Jankowski says. That evening, Farooqi insisted the group put their hands in for a go team cheer in their hotel lobby. Then he and Lee went up to their rooms to go to bed. Jankowski, sick, half asleep from cold medication, and clutching a pillow from his hotel room walked out into the pouring rain and got in a car with the Shi liaison to start the long night drive south. The Shi agent had begged Jang Cho-ski to take the wheel of another car in the caravan, instead of an elderly Korean man on his team who was, the agent said, a notoriously bad driver. But Jang Cho-ski insisted he was far too medicated to navigate the dark, wet highways of a country 7,000 miles from his home. A few hours later, the team arrived in the parking lot of Sun's apartment, a 10-story tower with a few small buildings on one side and a vast, empty rural landscape on the other to begin their long stakeout in the rain. It was well past midnight when they saw Sun's car finally pull into the parking garage of the complex. A group of Korean agents had been waiting there for him. One particularly imposing officer, whom the Shi agents referred to as Smiley because he never smiled, led a team of plainclothes police, sidling into the elevator next to Sun as he got inside. The agents silently rode the elevator up to Sun's floor with him and stepped out when he did. They arrested him, without resistance, just as he reached his front door. There were more than 250,000 videos on the server, more content by volume than in any child sexual abuse materials case in history. Throughout that arrest and the hours-long search of Sun's apartment that followed, Jang Cho-ski and the other foreigners remained stuck in their cars in the rain-drenched parking lot. Only the national police had authorization to lay hands on Sun or enter his home. When the Korean officers had the young welcome to video admin handcuffed, they asked him if he'd consent to letting Jang Cho-ski or any of the Americans come in as well. Sun, unsurprisingly, said no. So Jang Cho-ski was limited to a tour via FaceTime of the small and unremarkable apartment that Sun shared with his divorced father, the man with the soiled hands in the first photo they'd examined, as the Korean agents scoured it for evidence and seized his devices. The Korean agent showing Jang Cho-ski around eventually pointed the phone's camera at a desktop computer on the floor of Sun's bedroom, a cheap-looking tower-style PC with its case open on one side. The computer's guts revealed the hard drives that Sun seemed to have added, one by one, as each drive had filled up with terabytes of child exploitation videos. This was the welcome to video server. I was expecting some kind of glowing, ominous thing, Jang Cho-ski remembers, and it was just this dumpy computer. It was just so strange. This dumpy computer, that had caused so much havoc around the world, was sitting on this kid's floor. On the return trip, Jang Cho-ski learned exactly why the Shi liaison had wanted him to drive the other car. The elderly Shi staffer behind the wheel of the other vehicle in their caravan was somehow so disoriented after a sleepless night that he turned the wrong way down a highway exit ramp, narrowly avoiding a high-speed collision and terrifying his passenger, Aaron Bice. After barely averting that disaster, as the sun began to rise and the rain let up, the group pulled over at a truck stop along the highway to have a breakfast of gas station instant ramen. Jang Cho-ski, still sick and utterly exhausted, was struck by how anticlimactic it all seemed. His team had located and extricated both the administrator and the machine at the epicenter of the malevolent global network they were investigating. He had been anticipating this moment for more than 6 months. But he felt no elation. There were no high fives, no celebrations. The agents got back in their cars to continue the long drive back to Seoul. The next day, after finally getting some sleep, Jang Cho-ski began to see past the dreariness of the previous night's operation to understand just how lucky they had been. He learned from the forensic analysts who had examined Sun Jongwoo's computers that Sun hadn't encrypted his server. Everything was there, all of Welcome to Video's content, its user database, and the wallets that had handled all of its Bitcoin transactions. The scale of the video collection, now that they could see it in its entirety, was staggering. There were more than 250,000 videos on the server, more content by volume than in any child sexual abuse materials case in history. When they later shared the collection with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, which helps to catalog, identify, and take down CSAM materials across the internet, NCMEC found that it had never seen 45% of the videos before. Welcome to Video's uniqueness check and incentive system for fresh content appeared to have served its purpose, motivating countless new cases of recorded child abuse. The real prize for the investigators, however, was the site's user information. The Korean National Police gave the US team a copy of Welcome to Video's databases, and they got to work in a US embassy building in Seoul, reconstructing those data collections on their own machine. Meanwhile, to avoid tipping off the site's users to the takedown, they quickly set up a look-alike Welcome to Video homepage on their own server, using the private key pulled from the real server to take over its dark web address. When users visited the site, it now displayed only a message that it was under construction and would be back soon with upgrades, complete with typos to mimic Sun's shoddy English spelling. Bice spent 2 days with his head down, rebuilding the site's user data in a form they could easily query with Jang Choski and Faruqi standing behind him, pestering him to see if the system was ready yet. When Bice was finished, the US team had a full directory of the site's pseudonymous users, listed by their Welcome to Video usernames. They could now link every Bitcoin payment they had initially mapped out on the blockchain with those usernames and look up exactly what content each of those users had uploaded or downloaded. By the time the Americans were ready to go home at the end of February, they had integrated the de-anonymized identities from their cryptocurrency exchange subpoenas into a searchable database. It mapped out the entire Welcome to Video network, complete with users' real-world names, photos, and for those who had paid into the site the record of those payments and the exact child abuse videos those customers had bought access to. You could see the whole picture, Jang Choski says. It was like a dictionary, thesaurus, and Wikipedia all put together. They had, arrayed before them, the fully revealed structure of Welcome to Video's global child exploitation ring, hundreds of exquisitely detailed profiles of consumers, collectors, sharers, producers, and hands-on abusers alike. Now the final phase of the case could begin. Over the weeks that followed, Thomas Tamsey's team in Colorado began sending their Welcome to Video dossiers to SHE agents, local police, and foreign police agencies around the world. These targeting packages included descriptions of the suspects, the record of their transactions, any other evidence they'd assembled about them, and given that they were being sent out to law enforcement agents who had in some cases never been involved in a cryptocurrency-related investigation, short primers on how Bitcoin and its blockchain worked. There would be no coordinated, global takedown, no attempt to create shock and awe with simultaneous arrests. The case's defendants were far too distributed and international for that kind of synchronized operation. Instead, searches, arrests, and interviews began to roll out across the globe, prioritized by those they'd learned might be active abusers, then uploaders, and finally downloaders. Slowly, as Welcome to Video's users were confronted, one by one, the DC team began to hear back about the results of their work with harrowing, sometimes gratifying, often tragic outcomes. If not for cryptocurrency, and the years-long trap set by its purported untraceability, most of the 337 pedophiles arrested in the case and their rescued victims likely never would have been found. A Kansas IT worker whose arrest they'd prioritized when they found that his wife ran an at-home daycare for infants and toddlers had deleted all of his child abuse videos from his computer before the agents arrived. Prosecutors say he later confessed when remnants of the files in the computer's storage matched their records from the Welcome to Video server. When the agents came for a 20-something man in New York, his father blocked the door of their apartment, thinking at first that it was a break-in. But when agents explained what their warrant was for, he turned on his son and let them in. The son, it later turned out, had sexually assaulted the daughter of a family friend and surreptitiously recorded another young girl through her webcam, according to prosecutors. A repeat offender in Washington, D.C., tried to commit suicide when the SHE team entered his home. He hid in his bathroom and slit his own throat. One of the arresting agents happened to have training as an army medic. He managed to slow the bleeding and keep the man alive. They later found 450,000 hours of child abuse videos on his computers, including recordings of the girl in Texas that had been uploaded by the Border Patrol agent. As months passed, the stories continued to pile up, a mix of the sordid, sad, and appalling. An elderly man in his 70s who had uploaded more than 80 child abuse videos. A man in his early 20s with traumatic brain damage, whose medication had heightened his sexual appetites and reduced his impulse control, and who was deemed to have the same level of cognitive development as the preteens whose abuse he'd watched. A New Jersey man whose communications, when they were revealed through a search warrant, seemed to show his negotiations to purchase a child for his own sexual exploitation. Thomas Tamsey, as the lead SHE agent on the case, coordinated more welcome to video arrests than anyone else, more than 50, by his count, and was present for enough of them that they became a blur in which only the most jarring moments remained distinct in his mind. The mostly nude defendant he found in a basement. The suspect who told him he had been involved in the Boy Scouts and that children had always been attracted to him. Parents of victims who vehemently denied that a family friend could have done the things Tamsey described, and whose faces then went white as he slid printouts of redacted screenshots across the table. The cases spanned the globe, well beyond the US. Dozens of welcome to video users were arrested in the Czech Republic, Spain, Brazil, Ireland, France, and Canada. In England, where the entire case had started with an agent's tip to Levin, the country's National Crime Agency arrested one 26-year-old who had allegedly abused two children, one of whom they found naked on a bed in his home, and uploaded more than 6,000 files to the site. In another international case, a Hungarian ambassador to Peru who downloaded content from Welcome to Video was found to have more than 19,000 CSAM images on his computer. He was quietly removed from his South American post, taken to Hungary, and charged. He pleaded guilty. For the DC team, many of the international cases fell into a kind of black hole. One Saudi Arabian Welcome to Video user returned to his home country and was captured by that country's own law enforcement. Faruqi and Janzuski say they never heard what happened to the man. He was left to the Saudis' own justice system, which sentences some sex criminals to the Sharia-based punishments of whipping or even beheading. When agents searched the car of a Chinese national living near Seattle with a job at Amazon, they found a teddy bear, along with a map of playgrounds in the area, despite the man having no children of his own. The man subsequently fled to China and, as far as prosecutors know, was never located again. In each of the hundreds of intelligence packets that the team sent out, Chris Jankowski's contact was listed as the number to call with any questions. Jankowski found himself explaining the blockchain and its central role in the case again and again, to SHE agents and local police officers around the US and the world, many of whom had never even heard of Bitcoin or the dark web. You get this lead sent to you that says, "Here's this website and this funny internet money," Jankowski says, imagining how those on the receiving end of the intelligence packets must have seen it, and now you need to go arrest this guy because some nerd accountant says so. In total, Jankowski traveled to 6 countries and spoke to more than 50 different people to help explain the case, often multiple times each, including one US prosecutor and agent team with whom he had more than 20 conversations. Some were a little more high maintenance, respectfully, than others, he says. Bice, who oversaw the reconstructed server data, says he spoke to even more agents and officers, well over 100, by his count. Ultimately, from the beginning of the case through the year and a half that followed the server seizure, global law enforcement would arrest no fewer than 337 people for their involvement with Welcome to Video. They also removed 23 children from sexually exploitative situations. Those 337 arrests still represented only a small fraction of Welcome to Video's total registered users. When the US team examined their copy of the server data in Korea, they had found thousands of accounts on the site. But the vast majority of them had never paid any bitcoins into the site's wallets. With no money to follow, the investigators' trail usually went cold. If not for cryptocurrency, in other words, and the years-long trap set by its purported untraceability, the majority of the 337 pedophiles arrested in the Welcome to Video case and their rescued victims likely never would have been found. The IRS and the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. had taken an unprecedented approach, treating a massive child sexual abuse materials case as a financial investigation, and it had succeeded. Amidst all their detective work, it had been Bitcoin's blockchain that served as their true lodestar, leading them through a landmark case. Without crypto tracing, Faruqi argues, they would never have managed to map out and identify so many of the site's users. That was the only path through this darkness, he says. The darker the darknet gets, the way that you shine the light is following the money. Throwing money laundering investigators into the deep end of the internet CSAM cesspool, however, had taken its toll. Almost every member of the team had children of their own, and almost all of them say they became far more protective of those children as a result of their work, to the degree that their trust in the people around their family has been significantly damaged. Jankowski, who after the case moved from D.C. to Grand Rapids, Michigan, won't let his children ride their bikes to school on their own, as he himself did as a child. Even seemingly innocent interactions like another friendly parent who offers to watch his kids at the other end of a swimming pool now trigger red alerts in his mind. Yali Lee says she won't allow her 9 and 12-year-old children to go into public bathrooms by themselves. Nor will she allow them to play at a friend's house unless the friend's parents have top-secret security clearances, an admittedly arbitrary rule, but one she says ensures the parents have at least had a background check. Faruqi says the 15 or so videos he watched as part of the investigation remain indelibly seared into his brain and have permanently heightened his sense of the dangers the world presents to his children. He and his wife argue, he says, about his overprotective tendencies. You always see the worst of humanity, and so you've lost perspective, he quotes his wife telling him. And I say, you lack perspective, because you don't know what's out there. Gambaryan's wife Yuki says the Welcome to Video case was the only time her hard-shelled, Soviet-born husband ever discussed a case with her and confessed that it had gotten to him, that he was struggling with it emotionally. Gambaryan says that it was, in particular, the sheer breadth of the cross-section of society that participated in the site's abuse that still haunts him. I saw that everybody's capable of this, doctors, principals, law enforcement, he reflected. Whatever you want to call it, evil, or whatever it is, it's in everybody or it can be in anybody. In early July of 2020, Sun Jongwoo walked out of a Seoul penitentiary wearing a black long-sleeve t-shirt and carrying a green plastic bag of his belongings. He had spent, due to Korea's lenient laws on child sexual abuse, just 18 months in prison. U.S. prosecutors, including Faruqi, had argued that he should be extradited to the United States to face charges in the American justice system, but Korea had denied their request. Welcome to Video's convicted creator and administrator was free. The DC-based team that worked the Welcome to Video case remains deeply dissatisfied with Sun's mystifyingly light sentence for running, by some measures, the biggest child sexual abuse materials website in history. But Jankowski says he's comforted by the outcry in Korean society over the case. The country's social media exploded in anger over Sun's quick release. More than 400,000 people signed a petition to prevent the judge in the case from being considered for a seat on the country's Supreme Court. One Korean lawmaker put forward a bill to allow appeals to extradition judgments, and the country's National Assembly introduced new legislation to strengthen punishments for sexual abuse online and downloading child sexual abuse materials. In the US, meanwhile, the ripple effects of the case continued for years. Jankowski, Bice, and Suttenberg say that they still get calls from law enforcement officials following the leads they assembled. On the computer of the DC investigators' very first test case, the former congressional staffer who committed suicide, they found evidence in a cryptocurrency exchange account that he'd also paid into a different source of dark web sexual materials. They followed those payments to a site called Dark Scandals, which turned out to be a smaller but equally disturbing dark web repository of sexual abuse recordings. Jankowski, Gambaryan, and the same group of prosecutors pursued that Dark Scandals case in parallel with the tail end of the Welcome to Video investigation. Similarly, following blockchain leads to trace the site's cash outs. With the help of the Dutch National Police, they arrested the site's alleged administrator in the Netherlands, a man named Michael Rahim Mohammed, who went by the online handle Mr. Dark. He faces criminal charges in the US, and his case is ongoing. From the perspective of Welcome to Video's money laundering focused agents and prosecutors, perhaps the most interesting of the ripple effects of the case stemmed from the fate of the she agent they had arrested in Texas, just before their trip to carry out the site takedown in Korea. The Texan man had taken a rare approach to his legal defense. He'd pleaded guilty to possession of child sexual abuse materials, but he also appealed his conviction. He argued that his case should be thrown out because IRS agents had identified him by tracking his Bitcoin payments without a warrant, which he claimed violated his Fourth Amendment right to privacy and represented an unconstitutional search. A panel of appellate judges considered the argument and rejected it. In a 9-page opinion, they explained their ruling, setting down a precedent that spelled out in glaring terms exactly how far from private they determined Bitcoin's transactions to be. Every Bitcoin user has access to the public Bitcoin blockchain and can see every Bitcoin address and its respective transfers. Due to this publicity, it is possible to determine the identities of Bitcoin address owners by analyzing the blockchain, the ruling read. There is no intrusion into a constitutionally protected area because there is no constitutional privacy interest in the information on the blockchain. A search only requires a warrant. The American judicial system has long held, if that search enters into a domain where the defendant has a reasonable expectation of privacy. The judge's ruling argued that no such expectation should have existed here. The she agent wasn't caught in the Welcome to Video dragnet because IRS agents had violated his privacy. He was caught, the judges concluded, because he had mistakenly believed his Bitcoin transactions to have ever been private in the first place. Chris Jankowski says the full impact of the Welcome to Video case didn't hit him until the day in October 2019 when it was finally announced in public and a seizure notice was posted to the site's homepage. That morning, Jankowski received an unexpected call from the IRS commissioner himself, Charles Rettig. Rettig told Jankowski that the case was this generation's Al Capone, perhaps the highest compliment that can be bestowed within IRSCI, where the story of Capone's takedown for tax evasion holds almost mythical status. That same day, the Justice Department held a press conference to announce the investigation's results. U.S. Attorney Jesse Liu gave a speech to a crowd of reporters about what the case represented, how following the money had allowed agents to score a victory against one of the worst forms of evil imaginable. Chainalysis Jonathan Levin sat in the audience. Afterward, an IRS official named Greg Monahan, who had supervised Gambaryan and Jankowski, came over to thank Levin for his role in the case. It had all started, after all, with Levin's tip to two bored IRS agents in the Bangkok airport. Monahan told Levin that it was the most important investigation of his career, that he could now retire knowing he had worked on something truly worthwhile. Levin shook the IRSCI supervisor's hand. Neither he nor Monahan could know, at that time, of the cases still to come, that IRSCI and Chainalysis would together go on to disrupt North Korean hackers, terrorism financing campaigns, and two of the largest Bitcoin laundering services in the world. Or that they would track down close to 70,000 Bitcoins stolen from the Silk Road and another 120,000 stolen from the exchange Bitfinex, totaling to a value of more than $7.5 billion at today's exchange rates, the largest financial seizures, crypto or otherwise, in the Department of Justice's history. But as he answered Monahan, Levin thought again of the blockchain's bounty of evidence, the countless cases left to crack, the millions of cryptocurrency transactions eternally preserved in amber, and the golden age of criminal forensics it presented to any investigator ready to excavate them. "There's so much more to do," Levin said. "We're just getting started." Updated April 12, 2022, 4 p.m. Pacific Time. This story has been updated to correct that Jonathan Levin was born in the UK, not in South Africa.